line, and other people around other jurisdictions around the world set policy. That has, to some extent, happened in privacy, where the lead has been for the world basically by the European Commission. Second approach is the wait and see approach, which says basically, let's wait till there's a real problem, then we'll deal with this. And that too, the problem is that while that might be the case, when the problem emerges, it might be then already too late to deal with this, or other jurisdictions have dealt with it already. At a minimum, we need to think about options, and conceptually, and universities are perhaps good at looking forward to dealing with these problems, because otherwise a problem hits. Regulators, governments, legislatures then overreact, and then kind of in some ways there's a kind of a poorly thought through regulation, then a system emerges that's worse than thinking ahead. A fourth approach now is industry self-regulation. A fifth approach is for traditional regulatory agencies such as FCC, etc., FTC, to use their existing powers already by expanding it, interpreting more expansively. And then there is the approach of the traditional agency being given additional powers through a broader legislative mandate. And related questions are, and I hope that we will hear in some ways about this, the independent commission approach, that is independent versus the executive branch agency, the sectoral agency that, such as in privacy, that deals with every industry, versus the sector-specific telecom, broadcasting, internet type agencies, perhaps. Now, and a third dimension would be the national versus the state regulator versus the supranational regulator, all kinds of approaches that can be taken care of. So these are some of the things that we try to discuss today. Identify new issues, identify ways to deal with how the existing system can deal with it or cannot deal with this. And we have a tremendous set of speakers, and they're matched by a tremendous set of registered participants. And I look forward to hearing from all of you, but not at the same time, I hope. So let's get started. The first panel, shortcomings of the current system. We have our moderator, Kevin Werberg of the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. We have a panel with three speakers. Yes, three, because Reed Hunt, who was going to be in the last panel, is now going to be on the first panel. So Kevin, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellie, for organizing this very timely, very important set of issues. I suspect this will be the easiest panel, in that I doubt any of us on the call are convinced that the status quo is perfect, even before we start talking about emerging issues you're discussing. But the different kinds of critiques of the current system will be interesting in terms of the way they diverge. So as Ellie said, we're going to have three speakers. They'll each speak briefly, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So we'll start with Tom Hazlett, the second most famous person at the University of Clemson, except for Trevor Lawrence.
Yes, I am at Clemson University. Please don't tell any of my colleagues I was talking about this topic rather than the more important topic, and you're all aware of what that is. Thank you for that great introduction, Ellie, and I wish I'd had the benefit of that previous to the conference. There certainly is so much momentum towards regulation in so many different areas. That there's no question rules are coming. Rules will evolve. Rules have been evolving. And, there is great interest in this because of the numerous challenges that have come up. I could, briefly start by answering the question, should there be a national iMedia Commission, by saying no. That certainly doesn't convey much information. And we will keep the debate alive for at least 4 hours here. So it really, we need a perspective on what kind of rules should be encouraged and what kind of process we go through to even deciding what the next process will be. Ellie talked about the structure of a solution. And of course, that's what we're debating here. What kind of mechanisms, rules, laws, potentially a commission will handle the challenges best. And there are so many challenges, certainly in the very generic competitive environment. There's been a lot of talk, influenced to a great extent by Lena Khan's very influential 2017 article on the Amazon paradox. This idea of economies of scale being strategically created and exploited by large tech companies has put a new emphasis or a new interest in antitrust policy. It's a lively and robust debate, and I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time on that particular aspect of this. That's another conference, but that's certainly one of the many areas in which there's momentum to consider and reconsider how we deal with the current and emerging challenges on the internet. Certainly, cyberbullying is another aspect. Bad behavior online that is very personal and in many cases extremely damaging, even a public health problem. It turns out that there has been a lot of legislation at the state level in the U.S. There's certainly, I went and counted the Texas statutes that now have rules on cyberbullying. I found 16, 15 of which are in the educational code. Many of the statutes passed are actually being struck down on free speech grounds. So in the United States, we certainly have trade-offs there, and those trade-offs reflect, the issues around the world. The United States, with its strong protection of free speech, has a particular position on that. I'll get right to what I think this conference wants to talk about, and that is internet content and then privacy. First on content. Certainly, particularly with the 2016 election and its results, lots of interest in fake news and hate speech and propaganda. The question is, can content be usefully regulated by a new commission? I think we have some very useful data on this in terms of what we did in broadcasting some 75 to 80 years ago, 90 years ago now. With the Radio Act of 1927. And we know a lot about how fairness rules and equal time rules are in fact administered, and it's something that we have benefited by getting away from, because the open flow of debate, as bad as it was in broadcasting in many respects, really opened up and flowered when we eliminated the restrictions that were put in by a licensing regime and government commission type control over content. And I might say that immediately, it wasn't just in the late 1940s with television, but immediately in the late 1920s, regulators given the power to talk and regulate fairness and equal time and public interest in content will immediately go to quite partisan political positions. Stations in the United States with pronounced political opinions, including a socialist station, WEVD, and WCFL in Chicago, owned by a labor union, were essentially put asunder in terms of their controversial speech because they were considered propaganda stations that did not reflect what should be broadcast generally, which was offered by the sort of the lowbrow commercial fare on the popular commercial radio station. So we have to be very careful about this, and also about the corruption angles, the political rent seeking that we've seen with licensing of media in the United States and around the world.
So Tom, I don't want to cut you off, but we only have about 20 minutes for the whole rest of the panel. So what's wrong with what we have now? Well,
yeah, what we have now obviously is the other side of it, and what we open with. We have these major platforms such as Facebook that have a very straightforward business model. Trade some of your information, private data as it were, and we'll give you very interesting free services. Obviously Google and to some extent Amazon now operating on that bargain. In general, people are very willing to do this trade, and in recent experiments, for example, customers were found to say that they would give up Facebook for a year at an average price of $1,000. These are users of Facebook. On the other hand, regulating the flow of privacy, the private rights of users, is problematic, and there is a lot of outrage, much of it justifiable. And in fact, now there's a move to legislation. Senator Wyden in the U.S. has come out saying that it's time for Congress to act. Facebook can't be trusted. Well, what exactly is going to be done about it with the EU approach or with the U.S. approach that now is thought maybe to mimic the European approach? Is certainly not going to be as fast and as furious as the market. Right now, as we sit here, Facebook has lost somewhere about, up through a few days ago when I calculated this, has lost about $70 billion in value, market adjusted. This is not just the downward trend in the market, but since the major breaches, Cambridge Analytica, and then importantly the quarterly report that came out in late July that showed that users are using a lot less Facebook and posting a lot less, that there is a huge market penalty, somewhere between 15 to 20% of Facebook value has been eliminated. That is the sort of feedback we want. We want all the platforms to hear. We want very strong and very quick incentives to be administered. There may be certainly governmental help on this. Federal Trade Commission labeling or posting of information about breaches and so forth would be potentially quite helpful. It should also be seen that some of the worst breaches of privacy come with U.S. government computers and U.S. government employees. Certainly the huge China hack, where Social Security numbers and medical histories of millions upon millions of federal government employees were stolen, and the government, the United States government, did not even notify customers or directly even admit to the breach. This happened just a couple of years ago, and David Sanger's great book, The Perfect Weapon, describes this process. The actual solutions, that there would be some sort of new commission, new federal regulation, uncompelling in my opinion. I think that what regulators should do, such as the Federal Trade Commission, is try to figure out how more objective and actionable information is put out into the public domain by a responsible third party, which obviously could be the government.
Okay, Tom, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to cut you off, so I want to make sure there's time for Reed and Matthias and for a few other questions. So my apologies, but we have limited time.
Don't apologize
for that. Okay. Next up, Matthias Kurth from Cable Europe.
Think I can start with the first one, because Ailey asked us what are the options, and so to understand, maybe Jason, just could you go to my first slide? Okay, so I think if we talk about alternative options, what can we do? We should understand a little bit, like in Europe, and my role is more about Europe. The structure is already, and there's a very complex structure. And Ailey's introduction is we have a little bit of everything. There is a consultation phase. There are a lot of bodies who are created over the years who are more or less cooperating: BEREC, RSPG, ERGA, contact networks, the Commission, and they are starting a legislative process, which is always underway between the elections. Then there's an adoption phase. It's adopted by more or less three institutions in Europe: the European Parliament, the European Council, and the European Commission. And then there's an implementation. So I think we should really talk about what every role should be. What is an institution about? The implementation then is more or less done more in the member states by national laws, parliaments, and national authorities. And then we talk about enforcement right now. And the enforcement sometimes is done by the Commission in Europe, but also by national authorities. There's a kind of burden or work sharing. And then, indeed, which is in every country like that, we have an appeal level, which are basically the courts, the European courts, the national courts, who you can appeal to. So there is a very complex system already, and we have to be aware that there would be a big bang and all these institutions will disappear. So when we talk about, I think we really talk about more a kind of evolution than a complete big bang and revolution. So next slide, please, Jason. Yeah, what are the shortcomings? And it was already mentioned. There is still a kind of imbalance between the OTT and the traditional media in very many aspects. We are aware of that. Partly the new code in Europe now regulates some OTT services like interpersonal communication, now like the old services, but a lot of services are still out of the reach of this traditional regulation. Net neutrality rules, we have a big debate on both sides of the Atlantic, more or less favor the OTT. Infrastructure carriers have to bear the costs for the gigabit society, but the market value and the business model is more favoring the OTT. There is no consistent definition of OTTs, platforms in different regulatory environments. So they are always defined in different ways, like dissemination of terrorism is sometimes different than copyright and e-commerce than audiovisual media. Advertisement rules also favor the OTT, more or less there is an imbalance. Jason, the next slide, please. I try to be brief. Yeah, there is also an imbalance between OTT and telcos and media. They take advantage, OTT take much more advantage of big data and artificial intelligence, which are the upcoming themes, than the traditional media and the traditional telcos. So how can we handle that? That's more an issue of substance, but also of institutions, because they are regulated maybe in different ways. Editorial control by platforms is a big topic, like Facebook, YouTube. They are permanent under discussions how much they should care about illegal content, copyright, terrorism, hate speech. Should there be horizontal liability rules instead of the current more piecemeal approach? Should there be a more self-regulatory approach? That's what Eli also said. Should there be a code of conduct as a way forward, or more intrusive regulation? How to deal with growing market power of OTT? This is always more the competition law, a big discussion here in Europe. Is there a need to change the competition law rules, or are competition law rules fit? And also the institutions, the existing competition law institutions in European Commission and member states. For example, is data an essential facility? Have we to regulate data, access to data? Who should do that? In which way? Or keep existing competition rules and focus on better enforcement for consumer protection and other kind of rules. Also, the taxation on both sides of the Atlantic is discussed. A regulation is challenged how the big OTTs, the FANGs, should be taxed, if the taxation system is fair, or if there should be a change in taxation system. So in a conclusion, maybe to keep my time and to make a brief point, next slide, please. Jason, can you? Oh, okay. So the question for this discussion and for our conference is alternative options for the regulatory system. So this EU model, which I elaborate a little bit, has a lot of delegated powers to the EU Commission. And in parallel, there are still powers on the national and sometimes in media, even on the regional level, because it's a constitutional affair. You have to be aware many things in Europe are done by constitutions, and cultural affairs and media, like in Germany, are sometimes on the constitutional level. So you can't change it to the national level. I tried that, but it's impossible. You need to change the constitution, which is fairly impossible. So there is laws, authority, and executive powers are more or less pretty stable. And I believe it's unlikely that it will be changed in a revolutionary way. Also because of the political background. You know, we have a growing EU skepticism. There might be even a shift of powers back to the national level. We have seen the Brexit. We see a lot of populists in Italy, in Poland, everywhere. So the Commission has already executed its powers towards market abuse or platforms. So it's not like nothing is done. There are high fines for Google of market abuse. So there is an action. There is also an action from national regulatory bodies, the so-called NRAs. I was myself a head of an NRA in Germany. So these NRAs are cooperating together to have a common system, but they are also cooperating with the European Commission. So it's a kind of checks and balances. And an institution like BEREC is also very stable and was just reinforced at the end of 2018. By the way, similar organizations are now in the competition law and the privacy popping up in Europe. So there is not a black and white solution. There is a kind of solution of cooperation and of both levels are acting. So national competition authorities are also active in cases of market abuse of platforms, very much, by the way. Privacy commissions on the national level are active, and DG Comp on the European level is active. So the cooperation at the EU level, and that might be my bottom line, enforcement on the regional level also taking place with respect of data protection and other matters. Main takeaway, there is no real alternative, at least in Europe, for this model, and the balance of power between member states and the EU is essential. The ideal way out would be having less regulation and more reliance on a revised competition rule, which is fit for everybody, for OTTs and for other media, and create more or less a level playing field between OTT and traditional media. Maybe a last point, which just happened over Christmas in Germany. We had a big scandal on a privacy violation. Thousands of politicians had been hacked, and their private data went to the net, and everybody in Germany discussed, do we need a new law? Do we need hundreds of more stuff? Do we need new institutions, etc.? You know what the outcome was? A local police institution found out that a 20-year-old pupil who is living in its parents' home did the whole thing, even by using public information and just reparcel that, you know. So sometimes, and this local police authority targeted the suspect within a week. So there is an action, and okay, it's not like the Chinese or Putin or other kind of stuff, you know, like big hacks on a border level. But I think the lesson we can take away that a targeted approach sometimes is much more successful than if we discuss about a whole change of the system. So in this, it's a joke, you know, because this pupil really has done it sometimes even with public available information, and all the politicians came up with a lot of confusing suggestions before that came out. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Great, thank you very much for that. And as Matthias mentioned, he's also a former head of the German Communications Regulatory Agency. And our last speaker on the panel is Reed Hunt, the former head of the US FCC. And so I think a subtitle for this session could be, "We've seen the enemy and it is us." So Reed, turn it over to you.
Hi, Kevin. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to assume that if I use the word internet, it means media, all the kinds of different media, and I'll start with my conclusions. All media, if they are going to be privately owned, must be subject to public interest considerations, mediations, and constraints. It's useful to have the media be privately owned because then it can be subsidized by subscriptions and by advertising as opposed to by public funding, and it's more likely to be innovative. It's possible to have the media be publicly owned. It is in many countries, but then inevitably it will reciprocally be subject to for-profit considerations because there's just too much opportunity to make money through the media. So what I'm saying is, by way of conclusion, the public and private spheres must and always will overlap with respect to all media. Talking about how the public interest considerations should be implemented, it is better to have them executed, those public interest considerations, through an agency. There are 5 reasons. An agency can house expertise that builds up over time. Number 2, it can act with speed, at least compared to a legislature. Number 3, it can dig down into technical details. Number 4, the agency can, under a rule of law, be open. And last, absolutely not least, an agency can be subject to legislative and judicial review as opposed to an executive branch. So those are the reasons that it is good to have an agency be the agent of the public interest. There's always a danger of regulatory capture. That's another way of saying that for-profit interests can use government to advance their own pursuit of profit and power. But that's true with respect to the executive branch, maybe Washington, and that's true with respect to legislatures. So it is not more or less true with respect to an agency. Those are the reasons why we do want to have an agency. When we talk about the public interest, there are four basic considerations. First, it is essential in a Western government that the media be used to promote democracy. Number two, the media ought to guarantee individual rights, free speech, privacy, and others, right of association. Number three, the media ought to, particularly in the saturation case we now experience, it ought to be part of the national effort to protect security, ranging from terrorism to a variety of cyber warfare possibilities. And last, absolutely not least, maybe even first, the media ought to be part of a national effort to create new public goods. That is to say, goods that are going to be shared at low or zero cost by the whole society, so that the media are part of the warp and woof of culture being defined as the set of opinions and values that define a community. Those are the reasons why we want the public interest to express itself. When I left, along with a number of people on this panel, the job at the FCC, the internet was just fine, and now stuff is really all messed up, and what the heck has happened? Well, in this century, there was a effort that started now more than 10 years ago to try to regulate the big pipes of the internet through the concept of net neutrality. Wasn't that good an idea to begin with? It naturally became an idea that was, as just was said, used to the economic advantage of certain companies as against others. But now the bathtub has been thrown out with the baby. What do I mean by that? The FCC has decided not just to give up on the idea of promoting net neutrality, but beyond that, it is decided that the whole range of issues relating to the media is none of the business of the FCC. They've given up jurisdiction. This is a mistake. It's probably an illustration of agency capture at the grandest level, and it leads to the following. If the FCC isn't going to be the regulator, is there going to be any agent or agency that is going to implement the public interest considerations that I listed earlier? In the current federal system, probably not, but that's not the right answer for the future. So we need to have some agency get the job of articulating the public interest. It could be the FCC in a different administration, but it's going to have to be somebody. Political power abhors a vacuum. Some political power will be expressed in some manner, and probably not for another couple of years. What are the main problems right now that are not being addressed because of the abandonment of jurisdiction? Well, first, there are competition issues, earlier referenced by Tom. Second, there are a variety of behavior issues, Russia, 2016 election, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the fundamental issue that there are a host of public goods of a digital nature that can be and ought to be distributed to everybody for free, but there's nobody on the job of making sure that that happens. There are a couple of specifics that are worth noting, and that is that we have a lot of bad actors now out there in the internet or media world. They range from traffic pumping and traffic stimulation that reflects a grasping for monopoly rents in the old telecom world. We have a over commercialization, also known as incessant robocalls, that are driving everyone in the country absolutely crazy. We can't even get 911 or emergency calls to work without collapsing. And then just in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of that system, few weeks ago, the whole government shuts down, and now no one knows whether emergency calls really will work, so people could die. We have the increasingly sophisticated, almost impenetrably complex techniques for manipulating information on the internet. We have a excessive trust in markets, even after 2008 and 2009 showed to everybody on the planet the potential failures of markets. And we have a almost a willing submission to a winner-take-all model in ownership, which doesn't need to be accepted and is extremely unhealthy for innovation. The last thing I want to say is AI, artificial intelligence, AI, machines thinking for us. It is absolutely certain, this is my conclusion, absolutely certain that AI will be fused with what we're calling the media. And to put it really, really simply, before we even know that we have a question, we'll be told what to do. Human beings will only be a part of the affected ecosystem by AI. The whole infrastructure will be AI infused. The notion that there's no public interest that should ever govern that is preposterous. And so as agencies first need to be called back into being, they also need to be given, whether it's the FCC or more than one in the US, they need to be given a mission that is forward-looking, and that very much involves AI. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. So we are going to add on a little bit of time to the panel so we can do some Q&A. So the floor is open to all of you. Again, use the hand-raising function in WebEx, and Jason will give you the list to call on. If we don't have a question, let me just, or what people are thinking, let me just start in to the three. But those were all, three very good presentations. So this issue about that we need to change the system and we need a different regulatory structure, new regulatory structure, no regulatory structure, that's a conversation that's been going on for a very long time. So all of you talked about some of the different issues that are coming up with evolving technologies and so forth. But how much of this is that the context is different today that's causing a push for reform? And how much is it that we're in a very different macro kind of political climate that makes some of these changes seem more likely? Whoever wants can jump in on that.
Both. Yeah, it's a great question because they can't answer one or the other. It's certainly the percent of our activity. The percent of our activity now that is online, and the power of the information is of course grown enormously over the last 10 to 20 years. And then on the other side, we have tumult and divide in the political world. And so and you look around the globe, we talking about diversity already in regulation. It's probably not what I would have done in the EU with the data regulations, but boy, it's valuable for the United States to see the effect of that, helping on the privacy issue or not, and how innovation is affected there. We can look to the other, the scariest story we've talked about so far. I think we touched on China very briefly, and this rating system for citizens based upon big data. That's, if that's the future, a lot of people want to opt out of that. But that a regulatory commission really is not going to help you much there. So we do have diversity in how we handle these problems. We have to be, with all the momentum for regulation, we really have to be smart and try to overcome some of the political jockeying to really be as analytical as we can about the costs and benefits here.
All right, we got a question from Henning.
Sorry, mute button. So I'm curious across all three. I got the it wasn't clear to me whether we need expanded institutions, which seems like kind of a European model, or maybe even a model that we've had for the FTC and FCC, where they take on new responsibilities. For example, for the FTC, robocalls were not something that was part of the mission when the agency was founded. Or do we need new laws that actually create fundamentally new structure? I actually heard more of the former, as in relatively tweaking existing structures, both on the US level, FTC and FCC in particular, or in the European model, the existing NRAs would be a shorter term and more effective model.
Hello, here's Matthias. Can I just hop in?
Yes, please do.
Yes, I agree. It's two levels: the issue of substance, and there I think the big debates are how to regulate more platforms, because platforms so far are very powerful. So they are the target now of the discussion in the substance. You know, are they need to have more liabilities for a lot of nasty things. Who can do that? So I think it would not be, in Europe at least, the solution that only one institutions will look after that. Like I explained, I believe that there will be a constant kind of checks and balances between higher levels like the EU level and national level. And in the European discussion, that might be also a worldwide aspect. It's very unlikely that member states are delegating more and more powers to the national level, at least in Europe, because there is this Euroscepticism. But the outcome will be that there is this cooperative model, which I already explained, might get stronger. You know, both levels will be involved. There will be a lot of new bodies, or maybe existing bodies with new functions, and the legislation will be adopted step by step. But to be honest, all these issues are very, very controversial. There is just now a legislation on e-privacy, which is completely controversial. There is a legislation on copyright, which is controversial between Germany and France. France, for example, wants to have a control on copyright for all, and Germany wants to have an exception for small and medium companies. You know, so there, in all these issues of substance, we have not an agreement. Which in the end would also not lead to delegating all the powers to the higher level, because then the national level would have no say, and the national level is quite strong now and wants to keep a kind of final say on a lot of these issues. So there is a conflicting answer from my side, but I don't see an alternative that all these things will be overcome by a one-size-fits-all solution.
This is Reed. Let me throw out, I'm going to give really reduction to simplicity. So the whole internet thing globally is really in bad shape. I think we should all start there. Beijing wants to use it, as Tom just said, to maintain authoritarian state power. That's like really awful. Europe wants to use the internet to revivify and maintain European culture. I think that's a good mission. Too bad about the Brits, but it's a good mission. And then when we ask the mission statement of government in the United States with respect to the internet, you couldn't find anyone who even thinks that they're supposed to have such a mission statement. So we have just the abandonment of the topic by the participants in the public sphere, and that's no good.
All right, so thank you all. Unfortunately, we need to move on to keep this on schedule, but thanks to all three of the panelists for a great kickoff to the event. And Ellie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, panelists, and thank you very much, Kevin, for stirring this great group of people to stay on time. Thank you. And now we're going to move to the next panel, which is data privacy and security, emerging issues and the process to deal with them. And the moderator is Raoul Katz, who is
military records, perhaps a criminal record, hospital records, so on and so forth. And he said, by 2018, a researcher sitting at his console will be able to compile a cross-tabulation of consumer purchases, school records, unemployed situations. That is, he will have the technological capability to do this. Will he have the legal right? Poole asked. And he said, well, it is not up to me to speculate how society will achieve a balance between its desire for knowledge and its desire for privacy. So I bring this up too because I believe that, and so far, and I would urge the panelists to think about it, we've been jumping into designs of, let's call it as an institutional architecture and processes to deal with privacy, without maybe talking about what Poole, as a good political scientist, raises, which are trade-offs. What we might be giving away, what he calls as desire for knowledge. We are somewhat influenced by some of the bad things that have occurred recently, but we have to really think about what could be the unintended consequences of some of these things that we're talking about. And with that, that'll be my brief introduction. I will just bring the panelists. We have 4 panelists. And the first one is sort of collective participation by Stephen Messer and Jan Fu on the issue. So please, if you might want to go ahead.
Sure. Hi, good morning.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Messer. As Raul said, at Collective Eye, one of the co-founders of it. Collective Eye is an AI company that's focused on helping organizations think through how their sales and revenue are built and managed. We do that in a network format where people contribute their data, similar to Waze, where a community of sellers contributes their data into an overall network so that we can learn about how different organizations make buying decisions and how salespeople work with them. So obviously this is an important topic for what we do. I'll let Jan quickly introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Jan. I'm the head of legal here at Collective Eye. We only have a short time, so I'd like to focus the time we have on the emergence of artificial intelligence and the impact that data privacy regulations like GDPR have on the development of machine learning and AI. So when I talk about AI, what I mean is the ability of a machine to mimic human intelligence, and how that works in very simple terms is algorithms ingest a whole ton of data and then starts analyzing patterns from that data so that it's able to mimic human decision-making and intelligence. So obviously, AI has developed at breakneck speed. I think a few years ago, people were talking about self-driving cars as though it was something, decades down the road. And now we have these, self-driving cars are a reality. They're on our roads. It's not a matter of if, but when we'll be using them. I recently read an article in the Washington Post that cited a PwC survey. PwC asked CEOs around the world whether they thought AI will have a larger impact on the world than the internet revolution. 38% of executives in the US thought that AI would be bigger than the internet. And amazingly, 84% of CEOs in China thought that AI would have a greater impact on society and on the world than the internet. That's pretty amazing. So it's pretty clear to many of us that AI, which relies on large sets of data, is a hugely important technology. We can't ignore it. And so it's very, very important that the laws that we enact to regulate data take AI into consideration. So I have dealt a lot with GDPR, as have many technology companies. GDPR was enacted, went into effect last May, and it's by far it's the most far-reaching data privacy regulation to date. And at this time, it's really the de facto global standard, because any technology company that is on the internet is either already ingesting data from the EU or is at risk of ingesting data from the EU, and so is subject to GDPR. But one of the limitations of GDPR is it's really not conducive to the growth of AI. And in fact, as a regulation, it doesn't really even contemplate AI. So one example is GDPR's focus on data deletion and the right to be forgotten. GDPR gives companies the right to ask data processors to delete entire stores of data after the contractual relationship between the two parties ends. That's not very reasonable in the AI context, because if you delete an entire store of data, it's like giving the machine a stroke. It's like, excising a lobe from the machine's brain. GDPR also gives individuals the right to be forgotten. And while that is a worthy goal, the question is whether a person can truly be forgotten in the AI context. So if you think of AI as this living machine that's learning from patterns and remembering patterns, can you really unremember something once you've learned from it? Of course, the question we're addressing today is, should we have a national iMedia Commission and what that body should look like? So Europe's approach has been to write the rules of the game before we really know or understand what the game is. The US, on the other hand, so far has taken, I think Ellie mentioned at the beginning, a more laissez-faire, wait-and-see approach, which is consistent with what the US has historically done, like with the growth and regulation of telecommunications. Another question that's often asked is whether there should be an international comprehensive framework for data privacy. I think the New York Times just had an article about how leaders from Japan and Germany and China and South Africa all spoke at Davos about the need for an international standard. So given that, I think in our opinion, GDPR is flawed, but given that it's the de facto global standard, the question is, how is it possible to fix GDPR? And it's possible that a new international standard that has widespread buy-in and buy-in from Europe could replace GDPR. But having an international standard is a very tall order, given how differently countries view data privacy, and many of the panelists have already alluded to this. In China, there's really no expectation of privacy. The government can see everything. The Chinese government has widespread access to electronic communications and employs indoor and outdoor facial recognition. In Europe, privacy is a fundamental right. In the US, we're somewhere in between, right? So the Supreme Court has said, we don't have a fundamental right to privacy here in the US, but the Supreme Court has said that privacy exists in the penumbras of the Constitution. It's going to be difficult to create
You have one minute left, Jen.
Oh, sorry, great. So, it's going to be difficult to create an international standard. And maybe it means that we'll end up with 5 different regimes or 3 different regimes that companies will have to adhere to. And that's not a terrible thing. But whatever these regimes are, they're going to have to be nimble and adaptive. I think GDPR is an example of how a piece of regulation that started being drafted, 10 years ago, has not been able to contemplate technology as it exists today. So I don't know if there's anything Stephen wants to add in our last few minutes.
The thing that's challenging about whether it be a national media commission or how the frameworks of the 3 general regions that we've been laying out play out. But the challenge is always trade-offs require you to understand the trade-off you're making. And as a society, where you're finding some of these technologies are generally so new that the trade-offs are to put it on a community or a regulatory body to make before those trade-offs become apparent has partly been the reason why the U.S. system of a laissez-faire has historically led to the growth of major industries. As those play out, i.e. whether it be you look at Facebook in the early days, where people were afraid of giving up their personal information for privacy, to then it becoming hundreds of millions of users. This has changed. So I'll leave it there for the next.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jan. I'm very happy that you were able to articulate one of the sides of these trade-offs, because that will make it for a good dialogue. And with that, let me introduce Megan Stiefel from Public Knowledge. Megan?
Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. First, I just want to say a quick thank you to Ellie and Columbia for inviting me to participate in the discussion this morning. I've enjoyed the conversation thus far and wanted to focus also on bucketing my commentary into two sections. The first is responding to the set of questions that Ellie and his colleagues put forward in convening this particular panel. And the second is to propose and share a way that we've begun discussing at Public Knowledge on how to reframe societal thinking on privacy and security. So first, with respect to questions and lessons learned from the European-style specialized privacy agencies and the implementation of GDPR, and then thinking about whether a federal data protection agency is necessary, I'll answer the first question with a no, but explain it first by walking through our views on GDPR and how it might be incorporated into the US privacy legislative discussion that's ongoing. So as a general matter, GDPR with respect to requiring security and privacy is generally a good step forward. But taking a step back for a moment, my colleague Harold Feld in late 2017 put forward 4 principles that we argued ought guide privacy legislation in the debate in the United States. First, putting consumers in control of their data. Second, recognizing that context matters, so that where there is little choice for a consumer to participate and give information, that the law ought to recognize and provide additional protections for such information. For example, providing information for a credit check. Third, that there will be backward compatibility, which is to say that we recognize the sectoral approach to privacy that US law has taken over the past 200 or so years. And finally, looking to not preempt state laws where they provide a more comprehensive protection to consumers. So with those 4 principles, I wanted to quickly touch briefly on elements of GDPR that we think privacy legislation in the United States should incorporate. Thinking back to the first comment about putting users in control of their data, as we know, GDPR defines personal data, and we think that personal data ought to, in the United States, be data that's linked or reasonably linkable to a person, household, or device. Of course, that first recognizes that we need to define what we mean by personal data. At this point, it's not always clear and it's up to individual organizations, and often cases, in which case the consumer is left with a less than comprehensive understanding of how their data is being collected and used. Second, we think, consistent with GDPR, that consent ought to be an opt-in requirement, and it should occur before collection of data. We think that this consent should be granular, which is to say that there ought to be a perfect purpose specification. So a consumer could opt in to have their information used for research purposes, but not necessarily for targeted advertising. Third, we think that the sensitive and non-sensitive dichotomy that is currently prevails in US privacy law ought to be sunsetted for a number of reasons, but most importantly that oftentimes, as we're seeing now, the aggregation of non-sensitive data can be combined in such a way that can lead to sensitive indicia about a person. Not to mention the fact that we don't know how innovation will enable new uses of so-called non-sensitive data in the future, which can potentially exacerbate the first point I made. At the same time, we do think that non-consent-based lawful processing ought to be included. One can think specifically about the recitals regarding network security and the benefits to obtaining and sharing certain amounts of data to ensure security of networks and communications. We share the concern, I guess, with my predecessors in this panel with respect to user rights, particularly the right to be forgotten. Here, there's a concern that it can easily be used against the public interest, specifically by, for example, candidates running for election, removing information from the public about their prior wrongdoings. We do think that there's benefits to data minimization and limitations on repurposed data usage absent additional consent, which is to say that if, in my first example, if a user opts in to have their information used for research purposes, that it is not repurposed to then send them targeted advertising. Relatedly, there are good benefits, many benefits to pseudonymous data and its contributions to a range of social interests. So thinking about how to advance the use of pseudonymous data in the US privacy context is, we think, an important one as a corollary to GDPR. Sort of finally, I would say the notions of privacy by design and security by design, together with certification mechanisms that are under discussion in the EU under their Cybersecurity Act, we think are useful, and I will hopefully have a chance to touch more on that in a moment. Finally, we think that the penalties that our GDPR includes are also an important incentive to encourage better behavior by companies. However, we have to look at the fine that was levied against Google last week by France and question whether or not GDPR and the actions that companies took prior to its implementation were meaningful enough to change corporate behavior. I think that remains an open question, and we are still in the early stages of GDPR implementation, so it's too early to tell how effective it will be in moving corporate behavior to a more positive frame. So with respect to whether we think there's a need for a new agency, the answer, as I mentioned, is no. We think instead that expert agencies need to enforce existing law, whether that be at the FTC, including through monitoring and maintaining oversight over existing consent decrees. Also through the FCC, colleagues on the prior panels discussed the need for the FCC to, as we've said at Public Knowledge, get off the sidelines and enforce the law. For example, the customer proprietary network information rules that require companies not disclose certain types of information. As I mentioned a moment ago, enforcing existing law means also not preempting state law. We do think, though, that there's room for the rulemaking to be granted to the FTC to enforce and have a more proactive role in its areas of expertise regarding privacy and security. At the same time, we also recognize that, unfortunately, agencies over the years have been insufficiently resourced, whether it be through personnel as well as their ability to professionally develop expertise in the areas of emerging technologies in order for them to effectively enforce the authorities under their jurisdiction. For example, since 2015, funding at the FTC has decreased 5%. So with burgeoning amounts of data, it's hard to imagine how an organization that currently has the authority to enforce certain rules could actually do so. Finally, we do think that there's a need for the Congress to fully exercise its oversight responsibilities. The U.S.'s approach has always been a sectoral one, and we think that there's opportunity for Congress to be a more meaningful actor in this space to enhance the conversation. If the current administration's preference is for the FTC to enforce the rule, then Congress needs to better exercise its oversight responsibilities. But I think most importantly, we need to take a step back and consider and bear in mind the higher level objectives that these regulations are intended to address, which specifically is the ongoing trust in information and communications technologies. We recognize that economic development and the societal benefits that it can bring are increasingly and almost soon will be exclusively dependent on data. It's also important to recognize that without privacy and security, confidence in that data will continue to weaken, and that this erosion of trust threatens the ongoing use of technologies that generate data, thereby challenging economic growth, democratic processes, and global governance. Professor Hazlett already mentioned the OPM breach as a potential indicator of, ultimately a cause of increasing distrust in information and communications technologies. But one could look at other activities intended to weaken the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of data as additional challenges to user trust in communications platforms. Consider, for example, an activity intended to weaken the integrity of scientific data on climate change and the consequences that something like that would have, or the compromise of data about the supply chain of consumer goods for an organization that prides itself on being a benefit corporation, or perhaps more closely aligned to the national security interests. Consider an activity that would weaken the availability of systems contracted by the Department of Defense essential to protecting the national defense. The current approach to managing these risks, when an organization chooses to do so, is often framed narrowly in business silos that are ultimately framed as costs to the bottom line. To shift this operational mindset, we've proposed in a paper that we published last year that organizations instead draw upon principles of sustainability management to reframe the approach to security to one that contributes to the bottom line.
Megan,
Well, yes.
yeah, if you can wrap up.
Okay, sure. It's well established that companies that adopt sustainability management practices outperform their peers. I will quickly say that we're seeing indicia that there is progress in companies taking more seriously privacy and security. For example, the Tech Accord and Paris Call that the Microsoft Corporation are leading, the Charter of Trust that Siemens has put forward in connection with critical infrastructure systems, and domestically something called the Council to Secure the Digital Economy, which is a combination of ITI, US Telecom, together with efforts underway by the US government to improve the resilience of information and communications technologies. So I'll quickly close with a quote from Larry Fink's recent letter to the public, essentially. Purpose drives ethical behavior and creates an essential check on actions that go against the best interests of stakeholders. Purpose guides culture, provides a framework for consistent decision-making, and ultimately helps sustain long-term financial returns for the shareholders of your company. So whether we have a commission or not, it could be instead of a permanent independent commission, it could be a bipartisan commission. And one thing such a commission could examine is how to recognize and reward or penalize organizations that make or fail to recognize and enhance privacy and security as essential elements in achieving their purpose.
Thank you, Megan. I will remind the panelists about Megan's point where she mentioned the key thing is what is the objectives that we're trying to maximize in this. Obviously, she emphasized one of the two in the trade-offs that I originally mentioned. The other one remains important. What are we trying to do in terms of these build-up of knowledge? Just for some of you to understand, ICML, one of the top international conferences in machine learning, has 11,000 attendees this year. 2,500 papers have been submitted with an acceptance rate of 8%. And some companies such as IBM has submitted over 100 papers. So there's something to be said about this development of AI doesn't occur in a vacuum. These companies need data in order to pursue their development. And therefore, whatever we're trying to do has to be sure that we enable these kind of research to continue and doesn't stifle it. And with that, I pass it on to Amy Stepanovich from Access Now. Amy?
Hi, thank you so much. And I echo Megan's thanks to all of you who are here and to the organizers. Access Now, we're an international organization. We work on defending and extending the digital rights of users around the world, which means we work at the intersection of human rights and technology. My bio is in the materials, so I won't go too much into that so I can try to stay on time. Jason, if you can slide down. I think, there we go. To look at where we're going, I want to actually start at looking back at where we've been and look at where we are, because human rights are actually fairly uniformly defined and have been for a while. Many of these can be found in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the UDHR. This was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, and it's received really broad support from governments all over the world. And similar rights have been set out in other international treaties and agreements. Additionally, if you go down one more, the Code of Fair Information Practices has been the central contribution of the Health, Education, and Welfare Advisory Committee on automated data systems. So again, these are not new issues. These are issues we've been talking about for some time. The practices, the fair information practices, are the basis for global data protection, including the US Privacy Act of 1974, which applies as against government collection, as well all the way through the GDPR, the General Data Protection Directive in the EU. Go down one more. However, in the US, we have, as mentioned, a very different approach than the EU has taken. The primary way that we enforce privacy in the US is through the FTC's unfair and deceptive trade practices jurisdiction, with deceptive practices being some sort of representation, omission, or practice that is likely to mislead a consumer, and unfair meaning that an act or practice is causing or likely to cause substantial injury that are not reasonably avoidable. And so these are the only two areas really these are the only two activities that are really restricted right now in the US from a privacy perspective. Outside of very specific niche areas, health, education, welfare, we do have, as many of you I'm sure know, sector-specific laws. Do you want to tag down Jason? Hi, Jason. I saw you on the camera just now. There we go. However, the recent, as we know, we're talking a lot about emerging technologies. The growth in data and data collection practices keeps bringing us more and more toward a tipping point. We are going from, you can see on the left-hand slide, the giant computers, all the way to having our entire lives interconnected through the Internet of Things and powered by machine learning and very detailed algorithms. Companies have found over time, and they continue to exploit, making money off of individual data. This has driven collection of massive amounts of personal data before companies even have a specific business model beyond that, which is, from our perspective, not responsible, not secure, and it's not connected to any reason for the collection of that data. Just because it's a fast, easy way to turn a quick profit. And because of that, we haven't seen a lot of investment in alternative business models or any real incentive or market push to invest in alternative business models that aren't based on massive amounts of data collection. In fact, companies receive benefit by being the first to market. You see that all of the major companies were able to entrench themselves because they were the first out with some particular service. And once somebody is out there offering it, it's really hard for competitors to come in. This has been going on for decades, not new. We've seen this happen over time as the internet has developed, and we've also already seen the consequences. So if we can flip fairly fast through the next couple slides to demonstrate the several different consequences that have hit the headlines from the overcollection of data. And we're going to end with the tipping point, this one right here. This is the thing that I think finally in the US got people talking, what we call the Cambridge Analytica incident. So a quick background, personality quiz 2014, a researcher and his team were able to harvest information of 87 million people over Facebook and then contracted to disclose that data to Cambridge Analytica, who were purportedly using it to analyzing it and using it to create and purchase micro-targeted ads used in presidential elections, potentially in the US, but also the UK, Argentina, India, Mexico, Nigeria, Kenya, and the Czech Republic. These are all countries where it's been rumored that Cambridge Analytica has been involved. The people who were involved were both the people who use the app specifically, as well as all of their friends, which is how we get to 87 million. And for context, if we take the slide down, 87 million people is actually the population of Australia, Canada, and Texas, all combined. So if you want some sort of reference point for how many people that is, it's quite a good population if you look at it from the physical world aspect. Applying, if we go down, looking back at how the US law applies to this incident, no sectoral specific laws were really, you can go back up, Jason, were really pinpointed. There are questions about if the FTC Act applies, probably for those friends of friends who didn't take the quiz, but likely not for the people who agreed to have their data turned over. Facebook was also already under a consent order with the Federal Trade Commission, which means there are a lot of questions that come out as we talk about developing a new commission about whether or not the FTC has the resources or the will to apply the authority that it already does have. This was not a data breach, so state and territory data breach notification laws weren't invoked. There is a lawsuit, a common law lawsuit in DC. So we're going to see the District of Columbia itself filed a lawsuit against Facebook, and we'll see how that progresses. It was filed in December. And then international agreements, Privacy Shield, which people I think generally agree is necessary for the development of the internet as we know it, is actually increasingly at risk because of incidents like this. There have been several officials in the EU who have called for the agreement to be suspended because of this incident, which I think highlights the problems of the US approach and why we might need to move to a new system. Facebook collects about us, but we don't understand how they're doing that. These companies are under little obligation to provide meaningful information about whether and how our profiles are acquired, analyzed, or transmitted. Terms of service and use are long, they're complicated, and they don't provide a lot of useful information, even if you do bother to read them. For example, companies basically talk about third parties and vendors and business partners, which is where Cambridge Analytica would have fit, but you wouldn't have known the scale of the information going over. So kind of in short, we have this great history, but right now in the US, we're not protecting people, and we're not able to sustain that model if we want to provide some sort of meaningful protection. We might not know.
1 minute. Sorry,
Yep,
1 minute.
I'm going. We might not know where the consequences of putting forth a data protection law, but we do know the consequences of not having a data protection law. So where do we go from here? Scroll down. Access Now has also proposed several different things that we think a federal data protection law should imply, including a new agency, rights to access and erasure, not only the info you give, but info derived from that. Ask me about the right to be forgotten in questions. I do have very important clarifying information about that. I won't provide now for time. But we also want broad data notification when data is transferred to people. And to get there, last slide, there are a lot of bills that are pending. This list is even out of date now. There have been several more introduced this year. So I need to update this, but this is a quickly moving issue. Congress is quite interested in trying to get some sort of federal proposal off the ground. And I think there's consensus that we need one for the first time in the United States. Companies are supporting it. Civil society is supporting it. It's really at this point a matter of what's in it. And it's great to see the conversation having gotten that far. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Amy. Sorry that I had to cut you off.
No, not a problem. I was ready.
Okay. Yeah, without further ado, let me pass it on to Eric Null from Open Technology Institute. Eric?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Eric Null. I am a senior policy counsel at the Open Technology Institute, which is housed within the think tank called New America. I work on a lot of broadband and privacy issues in the United States. And so I have plenty of thoughts on data privacy and security. However, Amy and Megan did a very good job of giving the overview of privacy in the US and their views on it. And I'm in general agreement with a lot of what they said. So I think I am just going to forge ahead with two specific issues that haven't been talked about too much yet. The first one is 5G and the privacy problems that it presents. And the second one is civil rights issues related to commercial data practices. So 5G presents both old and new privacy issues. Some are related to the fact that 5G is provided by broadband providers, but some new issues related to the technology as well. So 5G, in case you haven't heard of it, although I assume lots of people have, it is basically the next generation of wireless connectivity. The current generation is called 4G LTE, at least in the United States. And so when we're talking about 5G, at this point, there is really no agreed upon standards. So we're talking a lot about generalities and making a lot of assumptions here. However, the basic concept is that we're going to have lots and lots of what's called small cells, where they'll be probably an average of 500 feet apart. And they are going to use high frequency spectrum. So it's going to allow for a lot of throughput and a low latency, but it doesn't travel very far. And the signal often gets interrupted by trees or buildings or, cars or what have you that are going through the signal. So we're looking at, a lot of investment from wireless carriers over the next several years to build out these so-called small cells. They're going to have a lot of uses. I mean, businesses are already champing at the bit to figure out how they can use them. Smart vehicles, remote device control, obviously, increasing video throughput and lots of others. And one thing I just wanted to note quickly is that we're still probably going to see most of the benefits accrue to urban areas in the US as opposed to rural, even though we hear a lot of people saying that this is going to be a solution to the digital divide in rural areas. Still, the return on investment is going to be much higher in urban areas, and so we're probably going to see a lot more investment there before we get any rural build out. So the broadband privacy issues associated with this are pretty similar to what we've seen before. They're the gatekeepers of the network. They know essentially everything that happens on it, the times of use for each customer, the sites that people visit, the devices they use, including potentially Internet of Things devices. And so ISPs are able to collect pretty extensive profiles and pretty accurate profiles on all of their customers. And of course, with Verizon and AT&T, we're talking about tens of millions of people, and I think T-Mobile as well. So that continues to be a problem. The new issue that we're seeing is all about location. Now that we're talking about having much smaller areas between different cell sites, we're actually going to be looking at very accurate location data, and we're going to be seeing more Internet of Things devices connected, constantly beaming our location to these cell sites. And so whereas cell triangulation is relatively accurate to about 3/4 of a square mile at this point, at least in urban areas, we're going to be talking about much more granular location data based on triangulation from cell sites for 5G devices. And so, there are benefits to this. It can certainly be helpful for things like 911, but it's also going to present all of these other potential privacy issues. Are you going to the grocery store? You might get an ad on your phone for junk food. Or you're going to a health clinic, you might get ad for holistic medicine. If you're going to the bank every Friday, you might get an ad for a payday loan. So there are lots of different ways that this information can be used in not so savory ways. One very acute example of that is the third-party location aggregators, which we saw last year, wireless providers selling real-time location data to middlemen or third-party location aggregators, and they were then in turn selling it to bounty hunters and collection agencies and that sort of thing. Wireless ISPs promised they would stop doing that, but it came out, I think last week, that they are still doing it many months later. And so there's obviously a propensity for wireless companies to monetize this data, and it's about to get a lot more accurate. There are also security vulnerabilities. Wireless companies having more and more accurate data about millions of customers makes them a very likely hacking target. And also Internet of Things devices in general are fairly insecure. And so there's going to be more opportunities for hijacking and hacking of those devices. We saw in 2016 the Dyn hack, which hijacked IoT devices and brought the internet down for a couple of hours. So 5G presents a lot of different privacy and security issues, some of them old, some of them new, but it's something we have to certainly keep in mind as more and more devices constantly beam our location, our very accurate location all the time. The second issue I said I would talk about is civil rights. And so it's not often that people combine civil rights and privacy, but we're seeing a growing practice here to basically acknowledge that commercial data practices are growing to the point that it is becoming a civil rights issue. And so my ultimate argument here is that companies and legislatures need to incorporate civil rights by design. Companies need to incorporate it into their products. Legislators need to incorporate it into their legislation. And so what do I mean by that? I essentially just mean technology and legislation needs to be developed from a civil rights perspective, centering the civil rights issues. There's too many examples of bad practices that lead to discrimination. We're talking about deceptive voter suppression and misinformation that's targeting African Americans. We saw this through the Internet Research Agency, which was spreading disinformation on Facebook and targeting Black Lives Matter and Muslim groups and immigration groups. Another example is discrimination in housing advertisements, which is made easier by being able to target housing ads to, for instance, certain zip codes or certain cities, leaving out marginalized communities. There's discrimination in employment opportunities based on who they're marketed to and where they're marketed. And then predatory marketing, such as for-profit colleges and payday loans, and then also social media marketing or monitoring, social media monitoring by law enforcement and ICE, targeting communities of color. So we need to be centering civil rights in our privacy debates to be trying to address at least some of these. And I'm not saying that a privacy law can fix all of our civil rights woes, but I am saying that it can certainly make things easier and take certain civil rights issues into account and help avoid or prevent problems from arising in the future. And some of those things, some of those reforms that might be helpful, getting away from transparency as the primary goal of privacy legislation. Transparency assumes that your reader is tech savvy and oftentimes legally savvy, and marginalized communities often are not. So relying on transparency is not a good way to get them more informed. Another thing we could do is prevent the use of personal information to discriminate in employment, housing, credit, other important areas, but also to not undercut companies' abilities to actually market to those communities. And we can declare online retailers and service providers to be places of public accommodations. This is something that a colleague of mine is pushing. We have public accommodations in physical spaces, but now there's a push to get online retailers and service providers to be sources of public accommodations. So that's just some of it. There's obviously lots more, and there's lots more to come on the debate. And so I just will close with saying that not only are civil rights and privacy connected, but privacy protections can help solve some civil rights issues, and we should be thinking about that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Well, these have been 4 great presentations and have given us pretty much a broad view on some of the issues, with even alternative ways by which they could be tackled in the field of privacy. We are open for 2 to 3 questions. So if anyone in the audience would like to, do we have any?
I can. This is Ellie. I can start this off. We had several proposals here for the or comments on an institutional arrangement such as a privacy commission. For fairness, there was an alternative model proposed also just recently by Daniel Castro at ITIF in Washington with Rob Atkinson that has basically in mind that, if I can summarize it fairly, just so that's on the table here too, that state regulation would be essentially taken out of the equation by federal supervision, that there would be a lot of industry self-regulation possibilities, and that a regulatory system would also take into account not only privacy, but also the offsetting aspects to privacy, such as law enforcement and innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So I would be kind of interested what the panelists think about the model of a specialized agency versus the more open-ended approach of the ITIF model.
Yeah. And just to tag along to Ellie's question would be, have any of you thought about what could be some of the unintended consequences of some of the recommendations that have been put on the table from, let's say, innovation or even investment, as Eric raised on the issue of 5G. So please go ahead. I don't know whether we want to go in sequence, starting with Stephen and Jan, and then move on to Megan.
Hi, how are you? So this is Stephen and Jen. Can everyone hear us okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. Look, these are, even if you were to take out the national level and just purely look at a domestic US view, the challenge that you have is the country itself has still not figured out the social mores that it accepts over privacy rights, the trade-offs that it's looking at getting improved benefits. So if you were the challenge that you run a state-by-state approach is that states take wildly different approaches. So a centralized approach is inevitable in the sense that it helps unify the country from a mission statement perspective, but it also does create more of a consistency and an acceptance of different views of what those trade-offs from population centers are willing to have. So it is inevitable. The question is always, when is the time and when have trade-offs been understood and when is there enough room for innovation? I think that's the challenge of, can you wait long enough without having local states come up with alternative approaches that might create an impetus that forces a decision before the trade-offs are fully understood.
Thank you. Thank you. Megan?
Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, perfectly well.
Okay. So I briefly touched on this. I think we're at this point don't think that a commission is appropriate because we don't feel that as though sufficient analysis has occurred across the ecosystem, including media, but also technology, in order to identify the necessary consumer protections appropriate for the interconnected era. So one of the questions that we would have about developing such an agency would be how it would address artificial intelligence. This was something we touched on in a paper that we published last fall. Where we called for an independent authority to help implement fair and equitable AI. So I'll keep my answer short, but instead, I think we think that there's an additional resources ought to be put to the question across the tech and media space, examining whether there are sufficient resources and authorities within expert organizations such as the FTC and FCC, and whether we can bolster those capabilities rather than establishing yet another commission.
Yes, I definitely buy that, because I believe that right now we're proceeding across silos between, let's say, the AI research community and some of the legal and policy issues. Amy, please.
Hi, yeah, so I think that the self-regulatory approach that I have heard Daniel champion in person quite frequently is just what we have now, and we know that it doesn't work. We do support a strong, comprehensive federal approach that takes into consideration the situation as it stands. We think there still needs to be room for the states. So supporting, I don't know if it's a iMedia commission or simply a data protection commission at the federal level, doesn't mean that we think we should cut off the states. There's been a lot of evidence about how the states, both historically and today, have been the places where innovation on data protection and privacy has occurred. If the states had been cut off, we wouldn't have the strong CalECPA rules that build upon the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. That's a federal law. California put even stronger rules into place. We couldn't have the Illinois biometric law that protects against collection of biometrics without user consent. So I'm not advocating for a super fragmented approach, but the states have been huge innovators in the privacy space, and I think they give great ideas that get fed up to the federal government and will allow those maybe eventually to be incorporated in the future in federal laws. So there's room for both. And on the innovation question, I don't think having a data protection law cuts off innovation. I actually think it feeds innovation in a lot of ways. As I mentioned in my presentation, we haven't had a lot of innovation, specifically around things like business models online, about what else we can do on the internet other than collecting massive amounts of data, which means the things that we get are often built not for the purpose of providing us a service, but for the purpose of collecting that data because we know it's lucrative. It would be really great if we could try to explore different ways to innovate, and I think we're starting to see that in different places. Yes, I also want to admit a data protection law is going to cost, especially at first, because any company that currently exists will have to try to figure out what it needs to do to comply with that law, hopefully to think about ways to go further than compliance, because we think that's the window where trust happens, is when you go further than what the law says. But waiting is what's caused that. If we had a data protection law 10 years ago, any company that would have been built in the last 10 years would have had to take that into account. Instead, we're entrenching current practices that lead to abuse and marginalization, and not putting in place the rules that we're going to need. So we actually think it's prudent to have these rules in place now to protect against much greater investment in the future when inevitably we will have rules.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Eric, finally.
Yeah, I can keep this relatively short because we're over time. I think the ITIF proposal takes us like several steps backward, getting rid of state laws, getting rid of all the federal sectoral laws, and lumping everything under a single law based on sensitivity and one other aspect I can't remember. I think that's unfortunately, as much as I like a simple, elegant solution, I don't think that actually gets us very far. I think it actually just removes a bunch of consumer protections and replaces them with something relatively weak. The opt-out requirements in that were also relatively weak, and it focuses on transparency, which is something I've said before we should stop doing. So as for another commission, at this point, at least for just privacy, I don't think I support a new commission just for privacy. If we were to lump things in with privacy, like if, as Reed Hunt mentioned on the prior panel, like the FCC just doesn't care about media anymore. So if we created a new commission that cared about media, then maybe that would be something worth looking into. But at least for privacy and security alone, right now, I think we support the Federal Trade Commission handling it.
Great, Eric, thanks. Thanks to all the panelists and for a great discussion. I'll pass it on to Ellie in order for him to introduce the next panel.
Right. Thank you very much, Raul, and thank you very much, panelists. That was really, really, really interesting, very great. Our next panel is about, it's a bit overlapping with privacy. It's IoT and algorithms, emerging issues and the process to deal with them. And moderating is Jason Buckwitz of CITI, the executive director, and who has also basically put this conference together in very major ways, both content-wise and technology-wise. Jason.
Thanks, Ellie. I'm going to try to go very quickly through on this. Don't want to spend too much time on the introduction because we're about 20 minutes behind so far, and we have 5 excellent speakers. So I would like to go right away to Henning Schultzring from Columbia University. You've got the floor.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on what I believe kind of the security privacy issues are for the Internet of Things and some initial proposals. Next slide. So the IoT, even though we think of it as a new buzzword, is actually, you can think of it as a pretty natural evolution of moving from a mechanical to kind of electromechanical and isolated to a networked devices. Often the devices are exactly the same. Really, the only difference is that instead of being a locally controlled electric device, such as a hotel door lock, say, it is now a network device with all the advantages and challenges that brings. Next slide. Indeed, the idea of IoT, even though it wasn't called that, is older than kind of consumer internet, certainly. Namely, some in the audience might remember that and still exists a system called X10, which allowed you to control your home appliances using a particular local network technology, power line communication, and that dates back to 1978. Next slide. And indeed, the term IoT dates back to 1985. I won't belabor that. The slides will be online, but it's relevant to note that even though this seems like a modern concept, we've been talking about this now for a generation, literally. Go ahead. So again, one of the things that makes things different is that these devices, as bad as potential privacy risks can be for traditional IT devices, now have the attack a possibility to interfere with real life physical security. Cartoon makes the point in various ways that this offers new opportunities for devices to be either with the consent of the manufacturer or without that, to be abusive in ways that traditional IT technology was never able to do. Next, please. And just to illustrate from a network perspective, we used to have a very simple technology. Namely, we had a home network. It typically had a single gateway and relatively simple outside communication, typically web pages, video streaming, and so on, that had clear security risks, but was very limited in its interaction. And indeed, to some large extent, leaving advertising aside, I knew who I was talking to. I knew I was going to Netflix, to YouTube, to Google, and I had some pretty good idea of what my network was doing. Next, please. In the IoT environment, that is not the case. Most people have no idea what their devices are talking to, who they're talking to, when they're talking to them, and what these entities actually do. Where they're resident, there might be many of those are not located in the United States. Many of those have other business models that I'm completely oblivious to in that. So it is mostly a LAN to cloud communication model, and that changes dramatically both for privacy as well as security concerns. Next, please. So IoT uniquely combines a number of risks, namely combines a privacy risk, denial of service risk, already mentioned, the ability for ransomware to have new opportunities both at the consumer level and, say, for a local water authority or local, particularly small electric utility, where somebody could not just threaten to wipe out their Excel spreadsheets, but to essentially interfere with safety critical systems. It can indeed provide opportunity for physical harm and enable other crime. And I just clipped some relatively recent examples of those where there's new privacy risks that are very different from what we have for even mobile devices in that. In often unexpected ways. I'll just highlight one, namely the use of IoT devices for kind of partner abuse or spousal abuse in that kind of new forms of gaslighting, if you like. Next, please. And one thing to point out, since we are in a business school forum, is that this is, if you look at just the denial of service one, it's a classical externality problem. None of the participants care. The device owners don't care because they usually, it doesn't interfere with their operation of, say, a camera. The vendors don't care enough because they've already been paid. They don't have any liability. And the ISPs also don't care all that much because usually the impact on an individual network is relatively modest. Next, please. And we have this problem that we have almost a perfect confluence of security problems for IoT devices. The devices have typically a very long supply chain. They might last for 10, 20 years. They don't really wear out. They're purchased once with no really ongoing financial model usually. The vendors often are hardware focused. They often don't have software expertise. There are lots of them, so any problems get multiplied. We don't have liability because for some reason when software is involved, liability seems to no longer apply. Even if there was liability, how am I going to sue some random vendor in China that may or may not exist at that point anymore? The software is often a combination of lots of open source and proprietary software that is hard to trace. There's no user interface to indicate problems. There's no protection against denial of service attack. And consent is often difficult to ascertain, particularly because they often affect third parties. Think of an Airbnb camera that I install. It's just not my consent that's involved. It's also those of my guests. Next, please. So the good and bad news is since we talked about a commission, it seems like every industry association has published guidelines and papers on that. So there's certainly no lack of thought on that particular topic. So my argument is we have enough white papers to last us for a while. And the good news is many of those agree on the basic ideas. This is not like there is a wide diversity on the technical side as to what should be done or better, what shouldn't be done. Next, please. Next, please. Can you put the next slide up, please?
Henning, the next slide is up.
I don't see it on my.
Which one do you want? This
I have slide 11 viewing, but I'm trying to get to slide 12.
I have it up.
Oh, okay.
I assume everybody else sees it too.
Sorry. So one idea, which I think has merit, it's not the whole one, is that consumers, I do believe, have a choice, and this is better than for privacy rules because it's usually an explicit purchase with an explicit discrete transaction in that. And so even relatively simple labels, I believe, could indeed foster better behavior if enforced, for example, by major vendors like Amazon. Slide 13, please. Oops, 13, next, previous one. So again, one of the arguments that is often made is that this change is far too fast, and so no regulator can keep up with that. I think that's largely bogus. We know how to do that by suitable delegation. I'll just mention as one example, PCI DSS, which essentially any vendor that accepts credit cards needs to conform to those rules. They're extremely detailed. They change about once a year. And for some reason, industry is able to cope with that, maybe grumblingly, but nobody has complained that this is overreach, and those rules are far more detailed than any of the IoT rules that anybody has proposed. And for some reason, millions of merchants directly and indirectly can comply with those without the US economy having come to a halt. So I believe there's plenty of examples where we can do detailed technical regulation by a delegation principle of increasing specificity and make that work. 14, please. And so if people actually wanted to solve a problem, we have ways to do that. So, for example, we have the FTC is responsible for the Textile and Wool Act that was passed in 1939 and enforces labeling requirements with relatively lightweight models. So for IoT labeling, we have a model of the OSHA regulation. We have a model of UL for city fire codes and insurance. So we have plenty of leverage if somebody wanted to apply similar models to that all have potential privacy and security, physical security impacts. Large retailers could require labeling. And next slide, that's the last slide.
That's the last I have.
Oh, sorry, last slide. So I do believe the time is for action, not just having more industry groups in that. We know we can do some short-term things and we can do some long-term things. Currently, it is a classical model where the risks of IoT are localized, as in the consumer bears almost all the risks, and the benefits of AI mentioned earlier are accrue to the company with no inherent benefit to the consumer directly. And I do believe it's time to change that, and we know how to do that.
Thank you so much, Henning. I really appreciate it. I think we learned a lot about new devices, and some very interesting questions will probably come up in the discussion section. So I'd like to move now to our next speaker, Jason Healy from SEPA, one of the schools here at Columbia University. Jason, can you hear me? Jason? We might be having some audio problems with Jason's microphone. Can you hear us, Jason? I'm going to move on to our next speaker while we try to get Jason connected. Bernard Benamou. Bernard, can you hear
Hello.
us? Hi,
Hello.
Bernard. Hi. We're going to move on to your presentation now while I try to help Jason out on the back.
Do you hear me?
Yes, you sound great, Bernard.
Thanks. And thanks to you all, and thanks to Ellie for a renewed trust in our conferences. Let me present myself. I'm Bernard Benamou. I'm dealing now with the Institute of Digital Sovereignty, and I've been in the past several times a government appointee for technology, and especially for the Internet of Things, for which we have built the first European Ministerial Conference about that a few years ago. Let me first begin by a quote, and I will tell you after who is talking. We have honed the Internet. Our companies have created it, expanded it, perfected it in ways that they, meaning the Europeans, can't compete. And oftentimes, what is portrayed as high-minded position, especially on privacy, are only sometimes is just designed to carve out some of their commercial interests. This phrase, this quote, which could easily be mistaken as a quote of your present President of the United States, was a quote by Obama. And what I'm trying to say is that we are now for the Internet, and next for the Internet of Things, at a crossroads, or some would say we are about to see a global systemic trust crisis looming in the near next few years, because as it has been said by Mr. Reedhand, and as it has been said by Megan, I guess, earlier, Europe is at exactly the opposite side of China, which has been quoted too, in terms of privacy, and the values we have been promoting has been many times mistaken as only based on our interests. Hello? Hello? Do you hear me?
You're fine, Bernard. Keep going.
No, I had a noise. So at this moment, the Internet of Things is still in its early shape, but we know that soon the devices that are not computers, that are not smartphones, that are not televisions, thousands, billions, some say, of those devices will be around us. If we are not shaping that Internet of Things the way we want it, then we will be in a Chinese social credit scenario that we don't want in Europe. And that's why I was happy to hear about GDPR thinking earlier in that conference, because it's something that has been long in the process, almost 6 years. It was in 2012. It began to be written. We will need some kind of new text. And to answer the question you asked, Ellie, do we need some kind of commission? I will not pronounce myself for the American system, but for Europe, indeed, we need a new collaboration, maybe a new institution, linking security, privacy, and technology in ways that is not currently existing. Because those new devices that will exist globally will have new issues related to them. And since the panel you invited me to talk to is about both the Internet of Things and algorithms, which could be translated now as artificial intelligence, those are closely related, because the devices will mostly be sensors getting informations, and on the other side, on the server side, there will be artificial intelligence, big data routines that will function to gather and to optimize those information. If we don't do now something that prevent large-scale accidents, like it has been mentioned, the Cambridge Analytica thing, which is not only about privacy, and that's, I want to insist on that. It's not about privacy only, it's about democracy. It's about influencing and manipulating people in ways that are more refined every day. So we need those next generations of technologies to be able to promote values we hold dear and not to become tools for authoritarian regimes or authoritarian parties in Europe, and we see that coming especially now, to use them as a tool to maintain their power on population. As an American academic, Mr. Frank Pasquale, has been saying, we need for algorithms such a kind of transparency, which is not existing now, and we need for devices, for chips, new rights, new laws that will uphold some kind of standards of security and privacy. We have been creating, and maybe Ellie remembers that, a concept which has been successful in Europe, but not in the US yet, about a new right for the Internet of Things, new right for citizens, which means that they can deactivate devices if they want to, and not being listened or recorded anytime if they don't want to. We call that right the right to the silence of the chips, meaning that we need to be able to silence those chips if we don't want them to talk about us. I guess one of the roles of an institution in the future about that could be to control and to promote such kind of rights in the future. We talked about GDPR, and I just wanted to say, indeed, GDPR was conceived a few years ago, and it didn't go that far into specific technologies, and especially not about artificial intelligence and not about Internet of Things. But soon there will be a need for a common set of values, not only for Europeans, I guess, but beyond, for the way we want those machines, those devices, those sensors, those objects to interact and to gather information, sometimes even to erase those information. As a friend of ours, Victor, has been saying in the past, maybe sometimes we will need something as a way to erase automatically data past a certain amount of time, because we know now that if we want to take some metaphor of movies, we want to stay at equal distance of two dystopian scenarios. One is Minority Report, and that's currently happening in China with the social credit, and the other one is Gattaca, with information about genomics and genes becoming one way of selecting people. And we see a lot of companies like 23andMe and others dealing with that and growing about that. We need to be sure that we don't go into such kind of path. In the past, we Europeans, especially we French, if I may say, we were often quoted as being anti-innovation about that. No, it's exactly the opposite. We want innovation, and we believe that innovation can be and must be a way to promote our values. I will quote another one now, which is Mr. Paul Nemitz, who is one of the lawyers of the European Commission, saying that as in the green business that has been created in Europe in the 70s and 80s, and created a new trend for business, we need to create a business about protecting data and securing data and protecting privacy. And this, for me, will be the core business and should be the core business of the Internet of Things for Europe and beyond in the few years ahead of us. Because if we don't modify the current trend, it has been, we have been talking, I heard about Cambridge Analytica, we could have been talking about Snowden and its revelations. Basically, we don't want what Wired was talking about yesterday, a convergence between the techno industry and the big brother-like institutions all around the world. We want to be sure that those technologies are not undermining the very core of our societies, meaning the democratic architecture of our society. And at this moment, okay, I'm about to finish. At this moment, we are about to see those kind of institutions being undermined by scandals like Cambridge Analytica, by revelation of how far manipulation can go. And we need to be sure that the Internet of Things, which will be the next step of evolution of permanent connection and permanent gathering of information about citizens, will not be the tool that some need to control even more the way we think, the way we interact, and the way we can build our societies. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to try again. Jason Healy, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you have me? Thank you. Thanks. It must have been something with my hands free there. So again, Jason Healy with SEPA. Again, my comments will follow in with those beforehand with Henning and Bernard on IoT. I'm on the, we can just get into more general cybersecurity if that makes sense, but I will stay away from the algorithms. I'm on the board of DEF CON, which is a major hacker conference. And so it's great. I get to see all the different hacks come in of people that want to speak. It's amazing to me on IoT because we almost don't even care about them anymore because so many different IoT hacks come in. I found a 0 day in IoT. It hardly even breaks notice. It's got to be either a class break against a really major set of IoT or a particularly important IoT for it to even to get initial notice by the board, or else they just write off, here's another one on smart lock, smart thermostat, smart whatever, because it is so much out there. For me, a lot of the problems of cybersecurity we can relate to the simple statement that the attacker has the advantage over the defender, that offense is greater than defense, that the advantage has far, far more advantages than the defender has, which I say is O is greater than D. The offense is greater, has more advantages than the defense. And we see that in IoT perhaps more than any other area. This is a trend that goes back at least to 1979, that we can see these quotes that the attacker has the main advantage. One of the other lessons from history that we know, I had done the first history of cyber conflict, was that, and I think this is still true, that no one had directly died from a result of a cyber attack. And that was largely because cyber attacks tended to go after, to break things made of bits and bytes, made of silicon. And those are relatively easy to bounce back from. You know, the computer eats your paper. It's happened to all of us. And all you have to do is rewrite the paper. It's relatively easy to bounce back from that. It's easy to be resilient. The more that we're doing the IoT, the more that we're doing smart grid, the more that we're taking connecting silicon and connecting it to the internet, but things made of concrete and steel, we can easily imagine this is no longer going to be true. That cyber attacks not just will disrupt bits and bytes, but will break concrete and steel, things made of concrete and steel. And I'm expecting that these days, where no one had yet died, we're going to look back at the golden age of the internet. Now it's going to be much easier to see deaths. And you can especially see that in areas where you've got cyber attacks that got loose out of what their designers had been expecting. You see this drive that happened a couple of years ago. It was intended to just be some gamers that wanted to take down some rivals, and ended up taking down a fair amount of the internet by affecting Dyn. You also saw it in nation-state attacks, such as NotPetya and WannaCry, that splashed well beyond what they were intended to do. So looking at particular elements of IoT, I think many of us are most concerned with water, because at least especially in the United States, the water authorities are run by localities. They are trying to get I don't want to say they're poorly run, but they're run on a shoestring budget. IoT devices can help them significantly to reduce those costs, increase their ability to do maintenance. But of course, they're now letting themselves open to the internet. Smart grid is a little bit of a mixed bag because there is some regulation in it. But what we've seen for the attacks in Ukraine, which took down the power twice, we've seen quite a bit of Russian activity and also Chinese activity in the US grid, in malicious software campaigns known as Black Energy and Havocs. And in fact, according to General Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence under President Obama, he had said, or according to David Sanger and others, General Clapper said that they took options off the table. The Obama White House took options off the table to deal with Russian election interference in 2016 because of Russian presence in the grid. They were worried about an escalation chain that might lead the Russians to take down the electrical grid. So you're seeing real practical concerns on this. So cyber deterrence exists, and it existed at least in the US being deterred because of Russian presence in the grid. Home IoT devices, and I think Henning had more to say on this. Just today, I saw Honeywell home thermostats. They were looking to take, they're going to be doing maintenance on home thermostats. And so now people aren't going to be able to use their home thermostats for long periods. You might not know, but there's an internet personality. He called themselves the janitor, the internet janitor. And he created BrickerBot, which would go through to home internet, to home IoT devices, and it would just brick the device. It would turn them in, it would make them unusable. And he did this because he knew that these would be taken over by hostile actors and turned into DDoS weapons, to botnets, that they would be taken over by malicious actors and used to attack others. So rather than let that happen, he went through to these internet home devices, and he just made them completely unusable so that they couldn't be used by the bad guy, using a worm malicious software that would go out to these devices. So really incredible. Now, it worked at scale. It was giving the defender a lot of advantage, but it was doing it by making these devices unusable to the people that had bought them. Now, I am a little bit more positive. There are some areas of sunlight here. If you look at what the FDA has been doing on medical devices, embedded medical devices and other smart devices, it's really great. They've been trying to do what they can to encourage innovation in this space, but still keeping some foot on the brake to make sure it's being done wisely. For example, the devices must be updatable. And they're trying to use some simple rules like that to make sure it happens. Really good work. I'm informed by a group of hackers called I Am the Cavalry that's been trying to come up and bring the hackers, social-minded hackers interested in the public good, and joining them together with the device manufacturers and the government regulators. It's a really, really great model that they've been applying to smart cars and other areas. For general cybersecurity, where I'm really interested in the cloud, we did a New York Cyber Task Force where we really had a lot of the New York CISOs that were singing the praises of the cloud. It's not free of risk, but the risks that you're getting with cloud tend to be much more manageable than those without. So we also see a lot of bright areas with finance sector, and we're really seeing it's well-funded, good relationship with the regulator, and regulation has been some limit to innovation, but also allowing them to do really good things. SEC and the FTC have been involved in regulation for publicly traded companies, for the SEC and for the FTC to crack down on when someone's saying their device is secure, coming in and saying that that's false advertisement. The area of the best innovation here has been, I think, the private sector, especially the core IT companies and platforms, as well as cybersecurity companies, who have been doing things like botnet takedowns and the kinds of things to coordinated activity to stop malicious behavior. And that's happening without regulation in partnership with the Department of Justice. They can really act at scale in the private sector in a way that the government can't do, but it's only part of industry that's incentivized to try to do that. So a lot of my solutions tend to be looking less at regulation than what can we do to encourage the right thing to happen rather than regulate it to try and do the right thing. We tend to get that through regulation for transparency rather than regulating for security. For example, the SEC guidance doesn't say to be a publicly traded company, you must be this secure. It says, boards, you're responsible for this. If you have a material cyber risk, you need to tell your investors. So regulating for transparency, and we think there can be good place in that for cybersecurity as a whole, as well as within IoT. Because as one of our colleagues says, Michael Solmeyer, we know most of the solutions that we need in cybersecurity. We've got a great sense of what we need to do. We're not sure who pays. So, for example, one of the solutions that gets brought up a lot for cybersecurity as well as IoT security is liability for the software manufacturer. So if it turns out not to be secure, that there is a provision for a public right of suit against those people, against the manufacturers. It's a great idea, but what that's going to do to innovation, it's going to really hit small and medium-sized manufacturers of these who can't afford the liability, and it's probably going to encourage the larger companies, the Microsofts, the Googles, the others that can accept cover for those kinds of liability issues. So again, we know who pays, but we're not quite sure what the knock-on effects are going to be, or we're not quite sure how much benefit we're going to get of the software liability versus what the hit to innovation might be. The same thing with things like liability. It's going to make the big companies bigger. We know that if ISPs were going to do more monitoring, so they're not passing the trash. Thank you. 1 minute. That's going to take privacy hits. So what does this mean about an I commission? If we said a commission to help focus responsibility, then that we can see that fits in with a lot of these solutions to help coordinate and do responsibility. When it's framed as far as regulation, I think a lot of us get more concerned because we're not quite sure what the impact of regulation is going to be, and we're me especially a concern that regulation is going to make a lot of things worse because we don't yet know the interaction of all these areas. Good solutions are happening in a million places, and a single commission, if we're not careful, might make some of those worse. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions in the conversation.
Thanks so much, Jason. That's great. So we're going to move on now to our next speaker, Bob Cohen from the Economic Strategy Institute. Bob? Bob, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Okay.
Bob, we're getting a lot of feedback on your end.
I see. Just a sec.
Well, Bob,
I'm going to take a slightly different approach, and my discussion is mainly on the need for not just an I commission, but
Bob, before you get started, I just noticed that your camera is not on. If you could just make sure that so everybody can see you.
yeah, I've tried to fix it up on my computer. It's not coming up today. I don't think I can bring it up. I've tried a number of times. It's just not. It's not starting. Sorry about that.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to take a fairly different approach. I've been looking at how businesses are actually using machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think there are a number of competitive issues that arise out of that, both in terms of how companies are using artificial intelligence, creating algorithms, and using data to train the algorithms as well as do machine learning. And I also agreed with the point that was made earlier in the data privacy group that there's a need to link AI to something like the GDPR, that we really haven't kind of considered a connection between data collection and AI, which I think is really important. I mean, the last speaker, Jason, was mainly on IoT, and I think IoT is quite pervasive now. We're probably going to have 30, 40, 50 billion devices connected in the next 5 to 10 years. But I think we're going to see far more use of machine learning and AI in the next few years, particularly as companies begin to introduce software that lets non-programmers and non-coders code algorithms, so that will really democratize machine learning and the development of algorithms. So the reason that I answer yes to the question that's posed for the conference today is I think there's going to be a good chance that the technologies that support AI will be complex and difficult to understand, and that the public and industries will need a kind of regulatory and innovative framework to evaluate different aspects of AI development, use, and refinement, and that new regulatory bodies, as Reed Hunt emphasized this morning, will need to build up skills for governments that need to be able to oversee how machine learning and AI is used, how the data that's essential for its use is amassed and managed, and how the results of AI models are applied, and how to evaluate that. And also the possibility, as Reed mentioned earlier, to create public goods. And here, as an aside, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of hospital groups and university research groups try to compile large databases of genomic and medical treatment data. And I think that that's an area where there might actually be a public good of that kind of information to use for a wide number of institutions if there were some sort of a commission that dealt with AI, and that as we're moving, you know, everybody's using things like smartphones or Alexa, and AI is really becoming pervasive, even though people don't realize it. So I think that that's another reason why we need to make this change. One of the other general issues is, can AI create new software tools that will alter the way that companies compete? In addition, the next point is, will the collection and preparation of data used by algorithms raise new issues concerning competition and control? And then lastly, if machine learning and AI become more ubiquitous and new software makes it easier for non-programmers to write algorithms, might there be concerns or needs to set some sort of framework when...
Bob, I just want to give you a 3-minute warning here.
Okay. Might there be issues raised when non-experts are creating expert systems? So I have a few illustrations of some of the things I've begun to see in actual use of artificial intelligence, or learning how to manage different processes within firms. One thing that's been happening is some companies, as in the financial industry, are trying to become Amazons for a single industry. So in finance, BlackRock has developed an Aladdin AI platform that it's leased out to more than 200 financial firms. And it's advantageous because it's one of the first platforms that lets financial institutions put a risk assessment on all the different individual investments that they're trying to track and manage. Some of the other questions that I've seen raised by new behavior in the industry is that if a firm succeeds in developing algorithms for one vertical like oil and gas, and it's a vendor of oil and gas equipment, might it use that strength to begin to integrate into another vertical like oil and gas production? And who would assess the competitive effects of that? I mean, I think that could be done in the Justice Department, but I think they have really no expertise to do that. If a company develops something like machine vision algorithms for retailing, might it be able to use advantages like that to consolidate the industry, to acquire or merge with a lot of other companies? And the other dimension that I've concerned about is whether AI systems might permit companies to amass specific data or expertise that would need to be assessed in a new context. If a firm got so much important data, might it be able to monopolize the pricing of the data or the access to analytical tools that are used to understand and build on the data? Another thing might be if AI service providers like an Amazon or Google develop data communications networks that include AI that are more sophisticated than traditional communications service providers, what kind of structures ought to be set up for regulating how they move in to become a mobile service operator or acquire traditional service providers. And those are some of the major concerns. I think there's also the innovation concern that Jason raised just before. One of the things I've seen is that companies that are using AI have begun to use things called regulatory sandboxes that let businesses test innovative products in the market with context of being in a lifelike situation, and the regulator can give exceptions to speed up the approval of the innovation. And I think that that's something that having new skills in a new commission would really help accelerate. So those are the main points I wanted to make. Okay.
Jason, you're muted. Jason, you're muted.
Oh, my apologies. I was saying thank you very much, Bob. And
okay.
To invite our last speaker, Andrew Tutt, to please join us.
Hi, hopefully everybody can hear me. I actually can't see myself on your video on the screen, at least not very well.
We see you perfectly, sir.
You can hear me. Hi, I'm Andrew Tutt. I'm an associate at Arnold & Porter in Washington, D.C. The write and study in this area, and specifically on sort of developments in algorithmic technology and algorithmic systems. So I'm coming at this even from a slightly different angle, not necessarily Internet of Things focused per se. In fact, I take kind of almost the biggest and most legal sort of legalistic, I think, view, in the sense that I look at this from the regulatory perspective almost primarily, sort of the struggle to figure out what is the governance scheme going to be with respect to the issues that are raised by sort of complex algorithmic systems. And so, you know, we've seen all the other speakers, Henning, Bernard, Jason, Bob, have sort of touched on all of these different sort of elements, cybersecurity being one, which is just malicious actors trying to break these systems, data, which is an input to the system and also an output from the system, social organization and communication, search, interactions between algorithms. All of these things all actually implicate different kinds of social harm and different sort of problems, which makes this an incredibly rich but also an incredibly difficult and interesting sort of regulatory challenge. So, you know, big picture for me, I think we're trying to understand what would be the best mode of governance, especially given sort of the path dependence of where we are right now, which is that we have all of these federal regulators and agencies already that are all structured in coherent ways, but all have overlapping jurisdiction over different tiny pieces of this really complicated puzzle. So just to give some examples of agencies that have regulatory authority that actually sort of touches on algorithmic harms in some way, I was just writing them down as I was listening to sort of the speakers. You'd have the FAA with drones, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration with self-driving cars, the CFPB with automated contracts and consumer credit, the FTC and the DOJ with competition, even the SEC or the CFTC with algorithmic trading and people having efforts both to use machine learning to sort of beat markets, but also having algorithmic traders then interacting with each other in ways that endanger markets. And all of them having very strange sort of interactions between their actual regulatory focus as they conceive it and the algorithmic systems that they may one day be charged with regulating or are currently charged, but maybe don't charge with regulating. So, right, so the FAA, a great example, the FAA is in charge of regulating air transportation and safety. Drones, though, have a massive privacy problem that they raise. So, and are often going to be assisted in their flight by complex algorithms that raise issues like those raised by self-driving cars. And so the question is, do we leave that kind of authority inside an FAA? Does FAA create its own splinter cell that then is supposed to develop competence, expertise, and regulations governing this? And is this what industry would want? And so when I think about this, I think about this kind of from an inverted a reversing of the spyglass. So one way that these problems are often approached is we have this harm to privacy, or this danger that is posed by an algorithmic system in some way. What regulations should we have about it? Whereas for me, part of what I think about is when you are a regulated party or when you build a regulator, what do you want the ideal regulator to be able to do? And so one of those obviously has a certain premise, which is in tension with sort of Jason's points, which is that I actually think that regulation is necessary, and the only question is how, because the absence of regulation is to sort of accept that sort of private actors will do as they wish in these spaces, or I heard some mention of kind of transparency, which is really parasitic on kind of a tort regulatory system, which is a regulatory system, just a really bad one from experience. And so we could say that we want to choose the tort system as the right way to sort of approach these problems, but it would be best if it was a conscious choice, I think, that we sort of had considered the idea of centralized regulation and rejected it. But for me, I think that that we need an algorithmic regulator where its central organizing principle is sort of harms and systems that arise out of algorithms. That their primary contribution to sort of at least the United States government would be their ability to be the central clearinghouse for expertise, the sort of the central focal point for complaints that uniquely arise out of sort of algorithms and algorithmic technology. Now, that's still going to give them a sprawling, somewhat unsatisfying jurisdiction, because they're going to be responsible for the algorithms in the drones and the cars and on Facebook and in the financial markets, and in shopping centers and stores where people are using facial recognition technology, and in criminal trials where police are using algorithms to do predictive policing. It's a sprawling jurisdiction, and I understand and very much respect that such a broad jurisdiction sort of immediately raises hackles. But for me, if I was a regulated party and I was thinking about what regulator do I want, unless I want a regulator that's fundamentally easily captured and ignorant, I'd want a regulator who understands that when I build algorithms, when I build machine learning systems, like that they have as much expertise as I do, that they understand the kinds of pressures that I face in like data gathering and training and producing outputs, and that they're sort of able to comprehend the language that I'm speaking with them. Now, that is not necessarily the same as an iMedia Commission. I mean, and it's interesting. The contrast is really, years ago, probably the first person to talk about sort of a unique technology commission, I think, was Frank Pasquale, at least that I've seen in his Federal Search Commission, was sort of, 2013. Everybody was noticing that Google had big impacts on the information that people were receiving. But then, a couple years later, Ryan Calo comes out and says, do we need a Federal Robotics Commission? which is about sort of the embodiment of algorithms in robots being able to cause physical harms in the world in a way that we hadn't experienced before. Now, for me, I actually think that we should do something broader. I mean, I should say I'm leaning toward the idea that we should do something broader insofar as the organizing principle is that both of those are growing out of the same sort of technologies. That in fact, the things that are powering the robots happen to be the same things that are powering search. And that both of those things, it might be best to have an agency that is sort of the central clearinghouse and the expert regulator. Which isn't to say necessarily that jurisdiction would have to be vested entirely in such an agency. But even if we created as a first step an agency like that, whose job was mostly to be the expert, but we left the actual regulation of drones, quad drones, in the FAA, but the FAA did all of its rulemaking in this area sort of jointly with the expert algorithmic agency, I think that that might strike a reasonable compromise. I mean, and I'm sort of anticipating objections, criticisms, and et cetera. I will say, does it make any more sense for a competition regulator to be the primary regulatory agency in charge of privacy in the United States, the FTC, than it would be for an algorithmic regulator to be the primary arbiter of privacy in the United States? You know, they're both imperfect fits, and so it ends up becoming a question of sort of among imperfect fits, which would we want? I mean, unless we're ready to just sort of make an agency that's there for every kind of harm. But of course, then that would raise its own problems as well. So this is a complicated problem. And, you know, I'm still learning, still thinking about it. But it really ultimately comes down to sort of the same concerns that drive technological development itself, which is, you know, technology is socially constructed. Bill Gates thought that the way that computers would be integrated into our lives would be that computers would be impersonal, right? That they would be built into the walls, built into everything else, and sort of the computer would not be something that you owned and carried with you. Steve Jobs had the exact opposite view, computer in every pocket. Now we have Internet of Things. That view clearly won out, but it only won out because we have a certain culture and a certain way of approaching and interacting with technology. In the same way, the regulatory outcomes and the regulatory means that we find acceptable are also going to end up being socially constructed.
Andrew, we really need to move to the.
Oh, and then, sorry, I wasn't hearing you, but okay, that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Andrew. So unfortunately, we're a bit behind and we do need to get to the next two panels. So I want to open it up. If we have a real quick question, if somebody wants to raise their hand, if anyone has anything. I know we had a lot of great comments, but I'm not seeing any, and we do have two full panels after this. So at this point, I'd like to hand it back then to Ellie and thank all of our speakers. And if there's any other time for questions, hopefully we can get them in. Ellie?
Thank you. Thank you. That was a truly great panel with lots of kind of talent here and knowledge. So thank you, Henning, Jason, Bernard, Bob, and Andrew. Andrew joined us at the last moment, so he gets a double thanks. Now, our next panel is about online video, the emerging issues, and the process to deal with them. And this panel is moderated by John Carey of Fordham University. Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. We're all familiar with the explosive growth of online video and the massive adoption, but what are the issues that we need to tackle and what process should we put in place to tackle them? So let's get right to our panel. And Andrew Reinsforth of AT&T, you're on.
Thanks. So can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to cover 3 areas in 9 minutes or less. First, I want to reaffirm what John just said, the explosive growth with some documented facts and figures. Second, I want to talk about how we at AT&T and our companies are monitoring and seeing regulation of OTT, both here in the United States and globally. And then third, just close out with or touch a little bit about how AT&T, through our various product lines, whether it be DirecTV or Warner Media or HBO, is seeking to meet the consumer where she and he want to be met with video products. So I'll dive right in. I'm going to tell you things you already know, but I found these statistics very fascinating and sort of affirming to what we all understand is the proliferation of over-the-top video. But there are over 200, and this is just U.S. statistics, but I'll also talk about things globally. But for purposes of speed here, just in the U.S., but this is mirrored globally in our experience, there are over 200 OTT video services in the United States. American households subscribe to 2.75 on average OTT video services. That's up from 2.18 just back in 2017. 2/3 of Americans own a streaming device, devices from whether it's a smart TV from Samsung or LG or an Amazon Fire Stick or Apple TV. And the number of OTT households in the U.S. has tripled since 2013 from 14 million homes. It tripled to 14 million homes in 2018. The four major OTT streaming services, Netflix, Hulu, YouTube, and Amazon. And note, none of those are owned by a cable or a phone company. They average more than 2 hours of usage per household per day in the United States. And then the final fun fact here is those four major OTT streaming services account for 75% of all OTT streaming time per month. MVPDs like AT&T, Comcast, Charter, Dish, which owns Sling, which is an OTT product, account for 10%. So that's sort of the scoping how important video is. If I can then turn to how we see and are beginning to monitor both U.S. and global regulators and lawmakers' engagement with OTT and online video. Obviously, that proliferation, that almost ubiquity is certainly calling into attention the focus of regulators and lawmakers. Particularly, I largely come from a U.S. experience, come from the broadcast industry and the cable industry that have grown up highly regulated with the beginnings of the Radio Act into the 1930s Communications Act and subsequent cable and satellite acts. It's just logical for regulators and lawmakers to turn their attention and focus to OTT as there's really been a shift away from traditional video providers. 5 areas of measures or regulation that we've experienced and we're monitoring and we're engaging with globally. The first, not surprising, is taxing OTT. Naturally, when you have that type of shift, if you're the state like Missouri, which right now is losing revenue from cable franchise fees, Missouri is looking at a new tax on over-the-top video because that's where the customer's going, that's where the money's going, and they want to capture that. But we see globally VAT taxes, custom duties, taxes to capture out-of-country corporations like ours sometimes that may be offering a service in a country like Singapore, but their domicile in the U.S. Local content taxes, taxes that seek to protect localized content and make sure that there's local production and production tax incentives all come under the tax category. Second area of regulation is content classification and censorship. Everyone saw the Netflix issue in Saudi Arabia last week. Platform responsibility, local content. In the U.S., we have a history of promoting children's video and all sorts of content regulations from closed captioning to hours of operation and what you can show for over-the-air television. Third area globally we're tracking is jurisdiction, locus, registration, licensing. Who has power and control over the OTT services that are oftentimes on what a regulator could seem as the amorphous internet. Fourth area is user issues, privacy and data location. I know you've talked a lot about that in previous panels, and consumer protection laws, truth in billing, et cetera. And then 5, the intersection of OTT with net neutrality. So I'm going through this quickly, but those are the 5 areas we're focusing on in the regulation of over-the-top video. And the final thing I'll touch on for the purposes of alacrity and time is where AT&T is heading. We launched 2 years ago after investing $67 billion in DirecTV, which is a traditional pay TV provider. AT&T launched an over-the-top service, DirecTV Now. That's grown to 1 million subscribers. We did that because we know that's where consumers want to head, but obviously that erodes a bit of the existing business, whether it's cable or satellite. We've also launched a product called Watch TV, which is a skinnier bundle, if you will, and that's designed to marry up with more mobile viewing. And now our sister company, Warner Media, has launched an innovation lab and is investing in all sorts of different types of content and innovation with partners like the NBA and Magic Leap to hopefully usher in an area of OTT services that iterate and innovate much faster and meet consumers in a more interactive, user-friendly way. And I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrew. Next up, Noam from Columbia.
Thank you, John. John has already kind of told us about online video and how important it is. At this point, about 70% of American household televisions are either directly smart TVs that are connected, or the users have some device like Roku that enables them to go on the internet. So it has moved from a niche application to the mainstream way in which people consume and watch television. But I would like to use this as an example of to answer the question whether we need an eye commission of some sort, and I will say yes. And yes, in other words, I would say not only one, but we really need 2 types of eye commissions. And I think that's where things will be going. There will be modifications of existing regulatory bodies, but I think that's where things are going, and that's where things should be going. And so let me explain this a little more. Now, one of the things that happened with online media, video media, is that contrary to the expectation that we had in the past, that there would be 1,000 flowers blooming and so on, and they do, but there's also an enormous market concentration that we observe and kind of are in some cases worried about, that is driven by technologies and economics that have economies of scale, network effects, and distance insensitivity and so on. So by a certain kind of economic technological logic, there will be kind of very large and very global type enterprises. And so the question is how to deal with those, as different countries are thinking about. And there are several ways to handle it. One is the newspaper model, which is laissez-faire, we do nothing. Another one is the antitrust approach, which is to break up or to prevent any additional mergers. And people have suggested that. Personally, I think that does not quite deal with the market power itself. It only deals with what you do with that market power, such as through mergers, etc. Then there's licensing and registration requirements and so on, and people have been talking about it, but I don't believe that that's going to do all that much or can do all that much. So what might be an approach conceptually to deal with that? Let's kind of look at the segments of the online video chain and think that there's the production of content, the platforms themselves, such as Netflix. Then there is data and algorithms we talked about, which I squeezed in here. Then there are the infrastructure platforms at the like CDNs and data centers. And then there's the ISPs towards the end, and the user media devices themselves at the tail end. And now, so if there is market power, one way to deal with that would be to say, let's kind of look in what segment market power exists, and then have some unbundling requirements. That is to say, that particular segment you also have to offer individually rather than a bundled way. And then you need also some access or interconnection, interoperability requirements linked to that. So if we go to the next slide, the next slide, please. Yes, you'll see that there will be kind of a whole bunch of arrangements that already partly exist and from the traditional media. Some of them are newer, of interconnection type, connectivity type. And they're handled by a whole range of different agencies. If we can go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Such as the Copyright Office for content production, that is compulsory licenses that exist in some cases. We have content, on the other hand, we have content platforms, which, as far as I can tell, nobody right now is really in charge of. We have data that is partly by the FTC. We have algorithms that nobody really is in charge of, maybe the FTC. Then we have some FCC arrangements. But it's kind of a bit of a messy system. If we could go to the next slide, please. I mean, one way to conceptually think about this is to divide up this into a horizontal and a vertical dimension. And the vertical dimension is the industry silo, which is the kind of video media itself. And so that would be under the responsibility of an agency, in particular in the United States, probably the FCC, with a somewhat enhanced mandate that would deal with also with content platforms and would also assure some interoperability with user media devices. So that would be the Communications Media Commission, IMediaCom, as it were. But then there's also a horizontal conventional regulatory body, which would be the in charge of the data and the algorithms and probably also copyright issues. That is to say, it would not only be about privacy and security, but more than that. And why would it be kind of separate from the, say, the iMedia Commission, the FCC on steroids, the FCC Plus? It would be because their responsibilities, as probably Andrew has already kind of alluded to, go far beyond a particular sectoral industry. That is to say, it would also apply to aviation and transportation and energy and banking. And not each one of these silo industries should have their own algorithms and privacy rules, et cetera, and security rules, but they should be broadly across the entire economy. And that would suggest another agency that is also but across the industry rather than vertical online media. Now, this could be the Federal Trade Commission, but here, that is probably too broad a mandate. The FTC has lots on its plate, and probably if you could just throw that into, it would be lost in the shuffle. So you have to have some kind of sweet spot between the too broad FTC and the too narrow only privacy. The problem with too narrow is that, as people have been saying, if you give a kid a hammer, the entire world, all of the world looks like a nail. That is to say, everything gets only measured by the privacy dimension. Nothing wrong with that. Then an agency like a specialized agency might miss some or undervalue some of those trade-offs. And so, next slide, please. Next slide, please. So basically, I'm suggesting that there would be two dimensions here, vertical, horizontal, agencies in charge, one functional and the other one industry. Now, if you go to the next one, there's nothing really unusual about that horizontal vertical split. If, for example, if you take media or whatever else, securities regulation, labor regulations, competition regulation, taxation regulations, they're all cross-industry. There's nothing unusual. Nor is there anything unusual about kind of getting international dimension here too, because people say, well, it's all intermingled and you cannot separate it. If you take a look, next slide, please. Next slide, please. You can divide the world up into jurisdictions, let's call them US and EU for kicks. And so you have both kind of on the functionally, horizontally, you can have different agencies dealing with something, and you can have it also vertically as applied to online video here and online video there. And so obviously there will be line drawing type issues, But conceptually, I don't think it is that complicated to have a regulation that make it possible for Saudi Arabia and Iran to have some kind of content regulation that is different from the United States or France. And kind of trying to find rules that apply to both of them or to all of them is going to leave everybody unhappy, and clearly it's not going to happen. Now, next slide, please. Was that the last slide? All right. So to conclude then here, there are many other online regulatory issues. I have no time to allude to them, such as affordability, access, child protection, cyberbullying, consumer protection, social harmony such as hate speech, national culture, taxation, technology compatibility, innovation, democracy, and more. Different countries, different societies will have their own different approaches here. And so therefore, I would suggest one size does not fit all. And this arrangement that I've kind of suggesting, namely the enhanced media commission whose authority goes beyond broadcasting and cable into online media, and the horizontal information protection broadly defined commission is probably where things should be going, and I believe that they will be going. The politics of transition, of course, are always complicated, but I do believe that's what's going to happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie. Next up, Howard Homanoff of Homanoff Media. Howard?
I just want to make sure I've got, can everybody see me?
We do. Not anymore, though.
Now you don't. Now you've lost me. All right.
Yeah, here you are.
Come on. Okay. Well, thank you, John. And I think one of the things, I'm going to probably focus more on the business environment, the changing business environment, and some of the ways in which we have, from the traditional media perspective, we have changed, are changing, and will change further. I think one of the things I want to pick up from a regulatory perspective is something Reed said this morning, which was that China wants to use the internet, using the internet as an example, wants to use the internet sort of for authoritarian control purposes, Europe from a preservation culture purposes, I'm paraphrasing. In the United States, we don't even really have a point of view now, kind of in our government. We don't seem to, and the current government seeming to not think we need to or should ever have one. So I think that the kinds of changes that I wanted to talk about are all things that whatever the structure that is retrofitted, changed, created, I think as Ellie's just been talking about, there are a lot of the understanding of regulators and the regulatory apparatus for these changes is going to be absolutely critical. And I think where I would start from is our regulatory approach to platforms and viewing them as platforms. We well know in the business world the impact of Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc. And when it comes to video, we're still in a world of the regulatory silos of broadcast, cable, telephony, and really virtually no jurisdiction when it comes to the FCC and their role in video as delivered via or by the platforms themselves. And I think it will be interesting to see what happens with some of the proposals that Mark Warner has put forward last year, I think last summer, Senator Mark Warner. While I don't expect any legislative action by any means, I think that those are the kind of thing that should help shape the debate about how we think about these platforms and their role in many ways as essential facilities going forward, and really a central part of the whole means in which an overwhelming percentage of the consumer marketplace accesses their video content. In terms of privacy, I think folks have covered that well, but one point again is you look at when the FCC sought to create its latest round of privacy regulations under the Obama administration, the fact that because of the FCC's jurisdiction, it couldn't even apply to Facebook, Google, Amazon, et cetera, which are, needless to say, the most prominent public examples of use and abuse of private data, personal data. It just sort of speaks to the antiquated nature of the way we approach thinking about platforms themselves. I think that in terms of what's going on in the business now, really probably the most central business question is what business models will emerge that contribute to a sustainability, the marketplace for the production, distribution, monetization of content going forward. We've had decades of, sort of this mix since the cable days of the subscriber and the advertiser in some combination footing the bill, and that's very much under attack on both fronts. Streaming has not yet proven itself to be a profitable model. Hulu is, and I'll put Netflix aside for just a moment, although certainly its profitability is a question, but if you look at Hulu, enormously successful in building subscribers and has just recently passed Comcast in terms of the number of subscribers to the Hulu service, still a service that loses significant money. The virtual MVPDs, whether they are part of an established enterprise like AT&T or some of the newcomers like Fubo or on a smaller scale Philo, have yet to demonstrate any ability to drive profitability, are really in a survival mode at this point. There was a very interesting analysis for those of you who follow Rich Greenfield, BTIG, just a couple of weeks ago, where he went through some of the economics or potential economics for Disney Plus. And there you have the most iconic media company that we have, and entering into the streaming space, and comparing the creation of a new standalone streaming service versus simply taking a check from Netflix to license their content, and it's daunting. And I think again, for startups, early stage companies, as well as publicly traded companies, that model of the subscribers supporting this enterprise in any significant way that remotely looks like what we've lived with broadcasting and cable for the last several decades, really is certainly far from there. The term subscriber fatigue, in fact, has crept into a lot of discussions that I've been a part of. I think we heard the note that 2.75 is the average number of subscriptions that consumers have today. Well, I do expect that will go up. It's not going to get to 10, 15 to replace it's not going to be 10 or 15 skinny bundles to replace the cable bundle. It's going to be I think consumers have demonstrated much less interest in footing the bill on anywhere near the size that they have for the last several decades. Then with respect to the advertising model, the challenges there are getting to anywhere near the scale that is enjoyed in the television business. And large-scale advertisers with large-scale budgets that have supported large-scale creation and distribution of content have a very difficult time finding the scale that they need in any efficient fashion in the AVOD or advertiser video on demand environment. So there are a lot of folks, and this space is going to get a particularly intense focus on it now. Within the last 2 days, we heard of Viacom spending $340 million for an advertiser-supported service, Pluto TV. It takes $9. And so I think that is going to be, again, and there's a lot of people in that space. You can go through an alphabet soup of Zumo and Tubi and Zumo, among many others. And I think, but all of them have the challenge of trying to build attention, scale, and credibility with the advertising community. one of the aggregators of eyeballs, of inventory in the world of online video is Roku, that is building that is between the Roku channel and between the selling of the inventory on a lot of different apps within the Roku service. And they are, I think they're demonstrating some capacity to build scale, but again, that is just another actor that's going to take a piece of the pie. It's neither, not supported by subscriber dollars, and so relying solely on advertising dollars for that. I think the issue of talent is going to be a significant one going forward. We still have, when it comes to union talent, we have an antiquated system in which broadcast is appearing on broadcast television. I'm talking about scale. I'm not talking about when Tom Cruise or Tom Hanks is in a picture, but for the vast majority of union talent, even for those who get to the union, it's right now a very different story. It's a very different story on cable versus broadcast, never mind online versus broadcast. And so I think that's a significant concern for the talent side of the equation going forward. Where does localism, we talk about other public policy values, where does localism fit into all of this? And that was really the backbone of the broadcast industry. And as there are so many more, again, for national advertisers, to be able to find scale through when you get to an online video world and you want to stream the CBS network programming, you have to be streaming 240 different online video streams from local stations rather than one national feed.
Howard, 1 minute, Howard.
Yep. And so I think, again, how regulators look, if you still believe in localism, what's the environment that you need to be able to protect and preserve localism going forward. And the final point I'll make, just again, simply for what they need to know, is to understand really the overwhelming power of Netflix. The Netflix model, I'm convinced, is not sustainable, of spending billions of dollars and losing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars a year. That's not going to last. But if they outlast many performers, many players in this space, they're going to have a very disproportionate base of power, and leverage over content creators as well as that.
Okay, thank you, Howard. Okay, next up, Michael Nelson from Cloudflare. Are you there, Michael?
Yes, I'm here. Do you see me?
I don't see you yet, but you're on.
Okay. I'm here not to really represent Cloudflare, which doesn't have a position on the Media Commission. I'm here more because I'm a technologist who's been working on internet policy for about 25 years. And my main role has been to stop stupid stuff and to help future-proof the policies that are adopted here in the US and overseas. I should also say that I'm a cyber libertarian techno-democrat, and believe that we can use technology to solve most of the problems we've been debating today, given the right policy environment and the right incentives and the right level of competition. If you want to join our Facebook group, we actually have a Facebook group for techno cyber libertarian Democrats. I'm going to make this very brief. Before joining Cloudflare, I taught at Georgetown in the Communications, Culture, and Technology program. And I learned how to speak in tweets. I've actually pre-tweeted my presentation. If you go and search for Mike Nelson, you will see a thread of comments that kind of provide a Twitter version of the slides I would have made if I'd made slides. So I'm not going to focus so much on the law. I'm going to focus a lot more on the mindset. And mindset is driving a lot of the policy in internet policy and particularly in media policy. And I think that's a good place to start, because too often we don't understand what's behind the concerns that people have that's driving some of these desires to do something. So I've got 7 points, about 30 seconds each. The first point is that I really strongly disagree with Ellie. I think he knew I would do that. We do not need a national iMedia commission. I, for one, don't even know how we would define what is and is not iMedia. I've spent the last year in Cyprus advising governments on how to future-proof their policies and their practices and to try to change some of the mindsets. We really have to realize that there's a major myth out there, and that is that the internet is a mature technology and that we need to regulate it because it's so important. The truth is there's still 4 or 5 times more innovation and new services that are going to develop if we don't constrain the business and the technology and the services. There's a whole new development here going on called serverless computing. The internet is not just a communication network. It's going to be a computing platform, not because there's going to be 2 or 3 big cloud companies that provide services from a handful or a few dozen giant cloud computing centers. We're going to see thousands, tens of thousands of small data centers on the edge, very close to consumers, and able to support a whole range of new applications, from the Internet of Things to online video services, customized to the needs of all the different users. Second point is we can't start with the traditional long list of concerns that have driven media policy in the past, and particularly television and broadcasting. Most of that, whether it's competition law, the need for public broadcasting, advertising restrictions, fairness doctrine, most of that's been driven by the fact that broadcasting was limited. There were so many channels, there wasn't that much bandwidth. And we just have to understand, particularly as we move to this new world of a global cloud, a global computer, we're not going to have these constraints. We're not going to have to decide what services are provided and whether they're provided properly. Third point, this really is an opportunity for global video services. And as Ellie said, different cultures in different countries require different approaches. And the best way to do that is to empower individuals with new technology. If we're worried about inappropriate material that somebody in Utah or Saudi Arabia doesn't want to see, give them their own personal filtering systems. Give them ways to verify that the services they're seeing come from the sources that they really want, not from something they don't want their kids to see. Another really important technology is going to be verification of the provenance of video, the potential for deep fakes and incendiary video, either real video or generated by computers. That's going to be important, and we're going to need some way to track back and make sure we know where something's coming from and know that it's a legitimate source. But again, we don't need governments coming in and pre-approving what we see. The biggest point that I want to make is that the internet is not a mass media. If you look at YouTube, most videos are seen, a typical YouTube video is seen by a few hundred people, even less. We always watch the videos that millions of people see, but there's an incredibly long tail. And the idea that we're going to structure our media policy around the big blockbuster videos and all the sources that we see on Netflix doesn't really realize that there's a much bigger world out there. The internet and even video is going to be much more like paper than like broadcast television. Fourth point, the new future of video is going to be easy. Cloudflare is one of a few companies that's offering services to make video just about as easy as posting a blog. We have something called Cloudflare Stream, very cheap and easy. You can turn on the computer and very quickly be generating content that you can share with the world. And that's going to lead to a lot of very specialized training video. It's going to lead to a lot of surveillance video. So you'll have 24-hour video in your house, perhaps. That's going to also lead to demand for smaller and cheaper cameras. And I should say that we really need to avoid the impulse to regulate those cameras, particularly for security. We had mentioned earlier of the right to the silence of the chips that would pretty much impose a $10 requirement on a video camera that might only cost $5. And same things, some of the proposals that are floating around would require 5 or 6 different security measures for any camera, when maybe 1 or 2 of those would be sufficient. Sixth point, we should not get over concerned about securing each device. Because the Dyn attack was caused by more than 100,000 networked computers, there's a tendency to focus on securing those networked cameras. There's a tendency to focus on securing all those cameras. Actually, we should focus on securing the gateways that connect those cameras and other devices to the internet. We don't need a cloud of secure things. We need a secure cloud of things, some of which will be very cheap, some of which will be unreliable and insecure. But we can protect those devices, and we can protect the rest of the internet from those devices by installing gateways and routers that control access to those devices. That's where it's much easier to manage the system, and it's certainly much easier to update the technology as new threats develop, rather than having to update every single device that's connected to the internet. If you haven't seen it, though, I would recommend you read a new book by Bruce Schneier, Click Here to Kill Everyone. Very important explanation of why the Internet of Things is offering new opportunities, but also serious new threats that we have to develop solutions to. And my last point is that as we see this world of cheap and easy video, and as almost everybody becomes a video producer, we're going to have to think about the implications for bandwidth. One of the good news about edge computing is that we're going to be able to cache video and other content closer to the consumer. We won't need quite as much bandwidth, but you can imagine that we're going to see this explosion in amateur video and new applications, whether it's for personal safety. People might be wearing a camera just like the police do when they walk out at night, just so if anything happens, we know what happened. So the last thought I leave you with the tweet. Just as in the 90s, Intel gaveth and Microsoft tooketh away, now we have the ISP giving us the bandwidth and online video taking it away. Thank you for the opportunity, and as I say, you can look at my my tweets at Mike Nelson on Twitter.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Okay, our panelists have been very efficient with time, and we've made up some time, but we still have some opportunity for questions. Any questions out there?
This is Andrew Reinsdorf. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I know I'm on the panel, but can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Of Ellie? Ellie, so I try to understand the regulatory chart, and I think Mike Nelson just did a nice job of talking about the global proliferation of video and the explosive growth. I'm not sure how you come through a United States rubric, FCC, FTC, to regulate video consumption in Saudi Arabia or Singapore or Switzerland. So inform me a little bit there.
Okay, thank you very much for the question, and also to Michael's comments. Let me address Michael's first. I would not argue, Michael and I don't believe that we have a fundamental disagreement. That is to say, unless you believe that there is no room for any regulation ever in this field, that is a totally libertarian model, as opposed to a lower regulation, less regulation type area. I think that is, which I think is unavoidable. It's unavoidable because there are some real issues and emerging issues. Also because there are other countries and jurisdictions that will also impose their rules, and so therefore they will kind of put some conditions, just as in the privacy case, on US operations. And so I don't believe that truly we can look forward to an environment in which there's nothing there. So then the question is, how do you organize it? How do you structure it? The question that Andrew put forward about Saudi Arabia, no, I did not say that the United States would regulate Saudi Arabia. What I was saying is that Saudi Arabia and the United States have their own set of requirements, and that the companies that serve these countries, including serve them from a distance internationally, would be subject to the laws that apply to the users themselves, the end users in those countries. So it might require the platform providers and the infrastructure providers to differentiate their video streams by jurisdiction that they sent them to. As it happens in electronics, that is much easier possible, so one can actually differentiate. And so the responsibility, say, of a Netflix would be, if they can service, say, Italians, would be subject to Italian type or EU type rules, as opposed to servicing US viewers. And if their server is in the United States and kind of rather than mirrored in Europe, then they would have to, before that that stream goes forward, would have to modify it in light of the laws that exist in Italy or in Europe.
But Ellie, I think the question is whether we need some new level of regulation and whether we need to pull up forward some of the old broadcasting style rules. And I just can't see how that's even going to work. I mean, we can't define what is and is not iMedia. Are we going to count all of the content that's being generated by the gaming sector? I mean, there's just an incredible amount of content coming out of all these kids playing games online and recording it as they go. You know, at what point do we say, okay, it's not television anymore? There have been attempts, 10 years ago, there were attempts to say, okay, we have to look at what's online, and if it looks like television, we're going to regulate it like television. But the fact is, it's all changing. I mean, it's much more interactive. It's three-dimensional. There's just so many things that don't fall in the normal category of media, and yet these laws you're talking about could scoop up those new innovations as well.
Well, Michael, I share your fear about innovation. And the problems of line drawing clearly are serious, but I do not believe that the reason why regulation exists in this area is truly because of spectrum scarcity. Spectrum scarcity was the historical nexus, and it kind of was because historically that was the case. But as soon as we moved away from over-the-air broadcasting, a lot of these things for cable television and so on still migrated over, not all of them, and some new ones. And when you look today at Europe, at the way that the EU has been doing this, and I'm not supporting this, I'm just reporting it, is essentially take the broadcast requirements and put them onto what is called linear type TV, online TV, which basically is kind of online television, except for these kind of YouTube type arrangements. And so I think that the reason why these regulations have existed in the past was because different cultures and different societies had different priorities. And so in Germany, they wouldn't want to show kind of Nazi paraphernalia, and in Sweden, they didn't want to show violence, and in Thailand, they didn't want to show anything negative about the royal family, et cetera, et cetera. In the United States, maybe sex. And so those kind of societal preferences are not going to go away simply because they have been, the distribution medium is now changing. And so there will be, whether you like it or not, being migrating, and you can see this everywhere. migrating over to the internet, and that could be not by direct regulation, by making it required, say that a Netflix or a YouTube, Google YouTube or a Facebook basically police their networks in light of some national rules and regulations. So I don't think this is going to go away, Michael. I share your libertarian sentiments, but I think that I don't see them disappearing.
Well, Ellie, I think the one thing we can very much agree on is that we do need to treat different parts of the online video ecosystem differently. I mean, your chart, I think, made that very clear. But unfortunately, in a few countries, they figured that out. But in other countries, they're writing very broad rules that could capture everybody from the ISPs to companies like Cloudflare that provide CDN services, all the way up to the media platform, to the media producers and the platforms like Facebook. So I think we have to keep making the case that different players have different capabilities and thus different responsibilities.
This has been a great conversation. Jason is telling me we want to try to stay as close on track as we can so that we finish within our overall time. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to Ellie now to introduce the next panel.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to announce the moderator for the next panel. His name is Noam. And the next panel and the concluding panel here is the how to reform the process. We have two speakers. Reed Hunt was going to be the third one, but he spoke already at the beginning, so we heard what he had to say. So as the first speaker, we have Harold Furchtgott Roth of the Hudson Institute and formerly commissioner on the FCC. Harold? Do we have Harold? Well, while we're kind of trying to get Harold in, let's talk to Bob Pepper. Go ahead, Pepper.
Yeah. Hi, I think we just, did Harold just come on?
I'm trying.
Okay, well, there you are. Okay.
There's Harold. Okay, so why don't we have Harold and Pepper, who's also happens to be the chairman of our advisory board, will have the last word. So Harold, go ahead.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Ellie, for organizing this conference. I've enjoyed the presentations. I'm going to try to be a rare position for me. I'm going to try to be the voice of realism here, and the realism is that, and I'm going to speak entirely about the United States. So those of you from other countries, this is a very parochial American viewpoint. New government institutions in Washington are rare. The last major truly new federal institution was the EPA in 1970, which was created by laws passed in the 1960s. If you look at, there have been a few reorganizations of existing agencies. The Department of Energy in 1977 was really just a combination of the Federal Energy Administration and the Energy Research and Development Administration and energy labs. Whether that was a big improvement is dubious. 1980, we had HHS and the Department of Education were splintered out from the Department of Health and Education and Welfare. Again, a dubious improvement. 2002, we had the Department of Homeland Security created from just a conglomeration of various agencies. I think anyone associated with the Department of Homeland Security would agree it has not been a helpful combination. So the idea that Ellie puts forward, I think very eloquently and very persuasively about the need for a new iMedia organization, I just, candidly think the odds of that happening in Washington are extremely remote. One can look at every major federal agency today and find its institutional history going back at least to 1970 and frankly, in most cases, back to World War II and the New Deal. There are a few odds and ends that are different from that, but I think you have to believe in very rare events to think that our federal government is going to is actually going to come up with a new organization such as Ellie has outlined. No matter how much the need might actually be, I just think it's very unlikely. There have been many calls over the past 50 years for new government organizations, but these calls have largely not been acted upon. And part of it is, frankly, just Congress doesn't do a lot of legislating. If you look at the activity of Congress in creating new organizations, they were very active in the 1930s during the New Deal, leading up to World War II, and in the 1960s. Other than that, over the past 80 years, there really has not been a lot of activity in Congress to create new organizations. The easiest bet in Washington is against Congress taking action on anything. And sometimes that's a problem, as we see today. The most likely outcome is that there is not going to be a new federal internet media regulator. What I think that means is if one is concerned about problems in the internet media space, and we've heard presentations today about some of those problems, at least in the United States, I think the most likely solution is to work with existing institutions. You might call this a Plan B approach. I think it's just the realistic approach. And let me begin by noting that existing laws have been very good to what I would call the American version of the internet. There's massive availability of broadband internet in the United States. And online commerce and online software in global markets are heavily American sectors. In fact, I think one could argue this is one of the very few sectors of the global economy in which American businesses actually have a fairly strong position. Specific laws that are around also are working reasonably well. Communications Act, I would say, generally works well. And I would say within the realm of agencies around Washington, I think the FCC generally works pretty well. That's not true for new organizations. If you were to create, if Congress were actually to create a new internet media regulator, I think it would take years, possibly decades, for it to actually come up to speed and be able to do anything. What the FCC could do is address communications in an online world. There may need to be rifle shot changes in the statutory language. That is something Congress can deal with. If you present Congress with a statutory change that takes less than a page to put on paper, that's the kind of thing that could be done. And it might be able to address some of the issues that have come up today, such as video, communications networks, Internet of Things environment. There also are a lot of areas where American law does not work well, and we've had a lot of discussion of that today, whether it's privacy, collection of information, marketing of information. A lot of these, I think, are likely Federal Trade Commission issues. I think, frankly, the FTC probably has all the statutory authority it needs to address these. But if it doesn't, again, I think Congress could do a rifle shot amendments to give the FTC authority. There are other areas which I think are likely to be technological in the nature of the solutions rather than governmental. Cybersecurity, various forms of online behavior, whether it's pornography, stalking, identity theft, false information, consumer fraud, and the like. I think a lot of those are more likely to have at least a heavy dose of technological solutions rather than governmental solutions. I would say one area that may need some focus, whether it needs new statutory authority, I'm not sure, is competition. And I think the federal antitrust authorities have been slow to figure out how to deal with antitrust issues in an online environment. But I think the largest set of solutions out there, and I think Mike Nelson was talking a bit about this, is a lot of the solutions are likely to be technological rather than governmental. And if this is part of Mike Nelson's Facebook group for libertarians or the like, I think there's a lot to be said for that. What we want to be doing, I think, is encouraging innovators, encouraging the generation of incredibly tech-savvy people around the world to try to come up with solutions to what admittedly are a lot of very serious online problems. I think if we can get people to create technological solutions to these problems, rather than relying on government institutions, we're probably going to be better off. After all, to the extent these are problems, they were created by technology, and the best solutions are likely to be technological. Thank you.
I'm also the moderator. Bob Pepper, who needs no introduction. Pepper, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Ellie, and thanks for that. It's really been a fascinating 3.5 hours. It went by very quickly. So let me just, not surprisingly, I agree with a lot of what Harold said, and also Mike, but I want to go back to actually one of our first presenters this morning, Matthias Kurth, because I thought that his bottom line, after going through the range of issues and so on, was really sort of cooperation among authorities. If we're looking at sort of institutional arrangements to deal with some of these issues, and actually, Ellie, that's not all that different than your horizontal vertical approach. It's thinking about how we organize the discussions, who organizes the discussions. But I want to go back to something essentially that I think maybe it was, if it wasn't Michael Nelson, and I'm trying to remember, it may have been something actually that you also, Elliot, said, and that is we have to go back to ask, what's the problem we're solving for? And I think that they're going to be there. Not only is there not one size fits all in terms of institutions, but there's not one size fits all that fits the problems we're solving for. The discussion on IoT, I thought was very, very informative. But boy, was there a wide difference of opinions. I mean, Bob Cohn wants to create a brand new super agency to regulate algorithms, whereas some of the other points were making, and it wasn't clear to me what all the problems were that you actually were trying to solve in advance based upon theoretical problems versus real problems. But some of the other discussion was really about the industrial internet. By the way, the security on the industrial internet with critical systems, electric grid, some of the issues that were raised related to that, I think, are actually really important. But the solutions are not the same, and it's not going to be a one size fits all. I mean, Jason Healy's whole discussion on critical infrastructure. So, one sort of super agency, I think. My top line is that it's not going to be one agency. I think we have to be practical. I do think it's going to be matrixed, and I think it's going to be cooperation among multiple authorities. But I think the bottom line also is that, and this is a Facebook position. It's not just mine. Is that it's not about regulation or not regulation. It's about smart regulation, and that's one of the things that, frankly, we're trying to figure out. What does that mean? On the one extreme, Ellie, you pointed out, at least in the U.S., although not in other countries, newspapers are not regulated, sort of laissez-faire. At the other extreme, there's government ownership, extreme government and ex-ante regulation. And the reality is it's not going to be either. I mean, there is a very important role for government. But as most of the speakers also pointed out, is a really important role for the industry. I mean, Harold's points about having a regulatory regime in the U.S. that allowed for the innovation that led to all of the growth of the internet, new services, online services, e-commerce, and so on. So the really tricky part is to figure out where on the scale, and it's going. By the way, I believe personally this can be different for different issues. Where on the scale? How do you define what smart regulation is, and what's the ecosystem of the private sector and government working together? Concretely, I mean, many of you know that dealing with one of the toughest issues in Europe is hate speech, and we're working on a project with some Facebook people, with President Macron, some people from his office over the next several months to try to figure out what is a workable, sensible, practical co-regulatory model that combines both private sector and government, and what our respective roles are, and do it in a way that provides consumer protection, meets the needs for national content in the case of hate speech or in France, but also promotes innovation and does not prevent future developments and innovation. It's balancing safety and openness. One of the earlier speakers said, made the point about, the tension between privacy and security, or privacy and law enforcement, legitimate law enforcement needs. So these are not either or issues. In my mind, it's actually sort of an evolving ecosystem that involves and includes government and the private sector. And I also think it needs to be multi-stakeholder because we need others at the table as well. So maybe that will generate a little discussion. I think we probably have about 10 or 15 minutes left for discussion.
Thank you very much, Pepper. Before I open the discussion, I would like to invite everybody to think of questions or comments that they will have, the audience. As to myself, let me just kind of address Harold's point about new agencies, hard to establish. Yes, that is absolutely correct. But I did not truly advocate new agencies. Think about what I did recommend, which is that for online media, which is what I was talking about, for online video, that is, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, would have an additional jurisdiction over the online platforms. I think that is going to happen in some form or another. And so it's basically not a new agency, but an FCC with some additional mandates, call it FCC Plus. That is the vertical. The horizontal is essentially putting the privacy aspects and security and others into something that could be called the Federal Trade Commission, FTC. And I think it's quite unavoidable, you just have to expect that this will happen, that some national privacy commission, board, or whatever responsibility will be lodged, whether it is inside the Federal Trade Commission. I believe that eventually it would be split out because it's just too much on inside the FTC to be responsible for. So it would be an FTC, as it were, kind of split into a subcomponent, something split out of it. So with that clarification, do I have, Jason, are there any hands up? Jason?
No, Ellie.
No. Okay, so then I invite possibly Harold to address the discussion, and Andrew has, I think, had to leave from the earlier panel. Pepper, you too, please jump in. So Harold.
slides to think there was going to be a new agency in there. I completely agree that modifying the responsibilities of existing agencies to address new technologies is both likely and frankly necessary. So I would agree with you there. Exactly how that gets done, I don't know. I would urge you to try to make that a little clearer in the slides, though, because I completely missed that. I thought you were calling for a new agency altogether.
Ellie, this is Mike Nelson. Just to break in, one thing we haven't spent much time talking about is surveillance and the growing number of places where the needs of law enforcement and the intelligence community are colliding against the needs for confidentiality, particularly for business applications, but also for personal users. And I don't see how you can expand the authority of the FTC and the FCC to deal with those implications. And I don't know how we're going to get around this. I mean, we are moving our entire lives into this cloud, and certain countries are already tapping into all those bits, and a lot of other countries are eager to make sure they can do the same.
And Ellie, along those lines,
Pepper, go ahead.
Yeah, that Mike just pointed out. I think what we're seeing, and this is where you have to be really, really careful. There are countries that are using some of these real and very important issues that we've been talking about, and what Mike in particular has raised in terms of legitimate law enforcement needs. But they're using that as an excuse for things like extreme data localization in the name of national security or protecting consumer privacy, but it's really being used as national industrial policy. And then also with some of the data localization and access to data, there are civil society groups that are raising questions about surveillance and how that impinges on their privacy. So I think you have to be extremely careful also about, again, going back to what's the problem you're actually trying to solve for before leaping to specific solutions. And data localization, in my mind, is one of those, where we see proposals for data localization and different countries are using it in the name of solving a whole host of problems that data localization really is not related to. And it's being done in a way and for reasons that have nothing to do with, consumer protection or competition. And I know, Mike, you've been running into the data localization issue as well.
So Mike, would you like to respond to Pepper?
No, he laid it out incredibly well. I think the only thing I would add, as I learned when I was in the White House in the Clinton years dealing with encryption, it's really hard to have an argument where only a small subset of people have the clearances that allow them to go in the SCIFs and have a full discussion about what's going on. And when countries don't trust each other, I mean, the Huawei concerns is a good example, I think, of where clearly people know some things that they can't share publicly.
That is a good point. So may I raise then the issue of the Bitcoin and distributed ledger technology more generally, and the ability of law enforcement and of tax authorities and of, for that matter, also others to the issue of the ability to control, if necessary, any central banks, macroeconomic type, and law enforcement, money laundering type issues, where that would reside.
It's too bad that Kevin Werbach still isn't on the line, because he's written an incredibly useful book on blockchain technology and would probably have something to add on that, because I don't.
So Harold and Pepper, any comments? Not just necessarily on this particular issue. So if that's
Well, Ellie, one of the ironies, by the way, I mean, so you mentioned blockchain. Earlier we had, I thought, a good discussion about some of the, I forget exactly who it was. It was, again, at the very beginning, some of the benefits of, well-intentioned GDPR, but also some of the issues associated with the specifics of implementing it. We're using GDPR principles everywhere. But one of the interesting questions about the GDPR, and I asked the question of an EU official shortly, and I guess it was July, so it was about 6 weeks after the May implementation. And people talk about the right to be forgotten. It's actually the right to delete, not the right to be forgotten. And so, of course, one of the really great attributes of blockchain is that for security and for auditability, nothing in blockchain can be forgotten. It's all there. And so my question, and it was in the context of this EU official talking about EU programs for innovation, investment, things like blockchain, new technology. My question was, well, I don't understand how you can be promoting blockchain that forgets nothing. And how is that compatible with GDPR, which gives people the right to delete, right? You can't delete. And kind of stopped him dead, and he hadn't thought about that. And again, it doesn't mean that there's not an answer or that it can't be fixed, but I think a really good example of, sometimes we have very well-intentioned legislation about technology that does not take into account how all of the aspects of technology. It's not written by technologists, and the technology evolves. And the question is, how do you, navigate that middle ground to have the appropriate and needed consumer protections while allowing the innovation for new things that actually will help protect consumers? I mean, I don't have an answer for that, but that's to me a really great example of something with competing positive interests and attributes that was not thought through.
Thank you very much, Bob Pepper. Bernard Benamou has his hand up. Go ahead, Bernard.
Hello and thanks. And since it was mentioned that Europeans were active in terms of regulation, maybe, and it's just a personal point of view, but maybe we have been naive, and I mean collectively, when it comes to thinking that the industry, when so big players are in place, can regulate itself. And we see now, and it has been mentioned by Pepper just now, and by Michael just a few minutes earlier, that we have a convergence of interests between large companies, which obvious and logical interest is to gather the more information they can about people, and large bodies of surveillance. That's what Shoshana Zuboff, the teacher of Harvard, was talking about, the surveillance capitalism. And the problem is we didn't address those issues timely. We procrastinated for a long time, and now and indeed I agree with Pepper when he's saying that most lawmakers are not technically savvy, and they don't know enough about technologies, not know enough about blockchains, and know that security algorithms of blockchains have been created by the NSA, for example, which is something very few know, for example. and they indeed, but there are some principles, not after the fact, but principles that can be upheld by design when the technologies are created. We are creating now technologies that can be toxic by nature. I advise you to read that very interesting paper in the Financial Times a few days ago about the Death Stars of data brokers and the large companies which are gathering so much information that they become a threat by themselves. And they know, and we know, that we will have to regulate them. I don't say that we have to erase the kind of business model of the data brokers, but indeed, with the GDPR and with the current evolution of public opinions in Europe, and I guess beginning to be in the US, the deal, the kind of threat they can represent is something that will have to be addressed in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Are there any other hands up? I guess not. Concluding comments by panelists. Harold?
No, this has been a great conference, Ellie. Thank you so much for organizing this.
Pepper?
It's been a great discussion. And just to Bernard's point, I agree that in fact these are some really important questions, and that's exactly why we have this effort that working with France on trying to figure out what does it mean, what does it mean to have sort of a co-regulatory model with with a set of principles. There's been some very good work on sort of these ethical questions by Luciano Floridi, who's a professor at the Oxford Internet Institute. And he's very balanced because, he's a professor of ethics. And so he raises questions, but he also looks at the benefits and tries to do the benefits and cost analysis. And he's done some very, very interesting work. For example, looking at mapping artificial intelligence projects with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so, some of these are Bernard, you're absolutely right. These are really important questions. And we're having to address them collectively in a responsible way. By the way, in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, Mark Zuckerberg laid out sort of, what we're doing at Facebook and actually talks about the tools that people have. Unfortunately, most people don't realize the tools they have to prevent sharing of their personal data for advertising, right? We need it for running the platform, but if you want to, you can prevent any of your personal information being used for advertising.
Those tools are often awfully complicated.
No, I agree, and so we've already made a lot of progress simplifying them. But the question is, how do you find them? How do you make it easy to find and use? And those are some of the things that we're doing with our engineers, making it easier. Mm-hmm. But again, this has been a great conversation, Ellie. And
great to meet you too.
We have already kind of dealt with conclusions here in the observations that several people here made. I would like to thank Bob Pepper in his capacity as our chairman of the advisory board, on final speaker in particular. Bob is our chairman in a personal capacity, not in a company relationship, because he had been our chairman through while he was serving on several other companies. So it's a personal relationship, and we're very grateful to him that goes back for many years. I'd like to thank again Jason Buckwise, Corey Spencer, and McPhee. His first name just escaped me for a second. Thank you very much for you guys for participating here, and you, the audience, thank you, and in particular the speakers who have taken time, sometimes got up early in the morning to participate here with us. So thank you very much for joining us, and say goodbye, and for some of you, good night.